My son jabbed his finger into my chest 9 times in front of our entire family, calling me a parasite, while his wife stood there filming and mocking me. I decided to wipe out their entire world. My name is Melvin Wright. I am 70 years old, a retired civil engineer, and a man who spent his life building foundations. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The deafening bass of Brandon and Megan's extravagant anniversary party rattled the crystal chandeliers of the rented country club. I sat alone at a neglected corner table, utterly ignored by the catering staff as they passed me by with trays of expensive appetizers. I wore the same gray suit I had worn for 10 years, looking entirely out of place among the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Brandon, my son, stood at the center of the room, holding court with the city elite. He owned a luxury car dealership and carried himself like a king. Megan, his wife, clung to his arm, displaying her diamonds. I stood up and walked across the polished marble floor. I approached Brandon just as he finished a loud, arrogant story. I pulled him slightly aside and quietly asked for a small loan to fix a leaking roof at my house. I did not actually need the money. I had millions hidden away in commercial real estate. This was a deliberate, calculated test designed to gauge the last remaining shreds of my son's morality and respect. I needed to know exactly what kind of ruthless man he had truly become since his beloved mother Diane died 5 long years ago, this very cold winter night, completely changing him. Brandon erupted in an unhinged fury that shattered the elegant ambiance of the room. He slammed his crystal glass onto a nearby table, causing several guests to gasp and step back. He stepped violently into my personal space, his face contorted with pure arrogance. Then he raised his right hand and jabbed his index finger hard into my chest exactly 9 times. Each physical strike was accompanied by a piercing insult that echoed through the vast hall. 1. You are nothing but a pathetic old man. 2. A complete failure who never achieved anything real. 3. You are an absolute parasite draining my resources. 4. An aging burden I have to carry. 5. You embarrass me in front of my investors. 6. Look at your worn clothes and cheap shoes. 7. You bring absolutely no value to my life. 8. I am sick of pretending to respect you. 9. You should just crawl away and vanish forever. The venom in his voice was palpable. Megan stood right beside him, holding her expensive smartphone high in the air. She recorded the entire brutal assault with a mocking, victorious smirk plastered across her pale face. She did not intervene or show a single ounce of human decency. Instead, she adjusted the camera angle to capture my humiliation perfectly, ensuring her social media followers would see every second. The surrounding high society guests fell entirely silent. Men in expensive suits and women in diamonds turned their heads, watching a son verbally and physically decimate his elderly father. Nobody intervened. Nobody offered a single word of defense. The music seemed to fade into a hollow hum as the reality of my son's dark soul laid bare before me. Every illusion I held about his character vanished instantly. I stood there, taking every strike, feeling the coldness of their betrayal seep into my bones. I looked into his empty eyes and realized that the boy I had raised was completely dead. He had been replaced by a monster obsessed with status and wealth while destroying the man who gave him life. The pain morphed into pure, terrifying, and absolute clarity. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or show a single trace of weakness. I stood perfectly still, absorbing the sharp physical pain of each jab while cementing the depth of the betrayal in my mind. 1 through 9. Each number etched a new boundary line between the father I had been and the architect of ruin I was about to become. Brandon expected me to yell, to cry, or to beg for his respect. He wanted a dramatic scene to justify his cruel narrative for the cameras. I denied him that satisfaction. I looked directly at him, letting a heavy, suffocating silence stretch between us. The anger radiating from him hit a wall of absolute calm. My silence unnerved him. His confident posture faltered slightly as he waited for a reaction that never came. I simply raised my hands and smoothly straightened the lapels of my worn gray jacket. I buttoned the front with measured precision, displaying a terrifying dignity that made the surrounding guests shift uncomfortably. I turned my back on my son, on his grinning wife, and on the whispering crowd of cowardly elites. I walked toward the grand front doors with slow, deliberate steps. Every footfall echoed across the marble loud and heavy. The crisp night air greeted me as the heavy oak doors swung open and closed behind me, cutting off the faint music and the toxic energy of the party. I had my answer. The final remnants of parental mercy were completely gone. Now only cold logic remained. I was fully prepared to dismantle his fake kingdom and teach him the brutal consequences of unforgivable cruelty tonight. I walked across the vast parking lot and climbed into the driver's seat of my rusted pickup truck. The worn leather groaned beneath my weight, offering a familiar grounding comfort. Before I could insert the key into the ignition, my phone vibrated intensely in my chest pocket. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin. It was an automated banking alert from a highly secured offshore account. The notification flashed boldly, demanding my immediate attention. The secret private trust I used to anonymously pay Brandon's staggering monthly mansion mortgage required its mandatory annual renewal authorization. For 3 long years, I had quietly funneled thousands of dollars every single month to keep his fraudulent empire afloat, allowing him to maintain the ridiculous facade of a wealthy businessman. I had shielded him from the brutal reality of his own financial incompetence, hoping my invisible support would give him the stability to mature. I realized now that my unseen generosity had only fueled his extreme arrogance. He believed he was a self-made titan, utterly blind to the fact that his parasite father was the only pillar keeping his entire life from collapsing into absolute ruin. I stared at the glowing digital prompt for a long, silent moment. I did not feel a single shred of hesitation or remorse. The choice was wonderfully simple. I pressed my thumb firmly against the cancellation button. The system processed the command instantly and permanently terminated the massive flow of funds. The financial oxygen line was completely severed. The purge had officially begun tonight. The tires of my rusted pickup truck hummed against the cold asphalt as I drove through the dark streets of the city. Streetlights cast long shadows across the dashboard, illuminating the empty passenger seat where Diane used to sit. My late wife had a brilliant mind and a spirit forged in steel. When we first built our massive commercial real estate portfolio, we made a solemn pact to hide every single dime from Brandon. We wanted him to understand the absolute value of hard work to build his own foundations from the ground up, just as we had done. Diane knew that unearned wealth was a poison that destroyed character. She warned me constantly not to pave his road with gold. But when she passed away 5 years ago, grief broke my resolve. I could not stand the thought of watching our only son struggle while I sat on a hidden mountain of cash. I began the silent financial coddling. I set up the anonymous trust fund to cover his expensive mansion mortgage and funneled capital to stabilize his failing dealership. I thought I was protecting him from the harsh realities of the business world. I thought my invisible support would buy him the time he needed to mature into a responsible man. Instead, my hidden generosity cultivated a ruthless, entitled monster. He took the invisible safety net for granted and convinced himself he was an independent titan. He believed his success was entirely his own doing. The reality was that his entire luxurious existence was built on a fragile house of cards heavily subsidized by the father he had just publicly assaulted. My misplaced grief had completely armed the enemy against me. The time for silent subsidies was officially over right now and forever. Morning arrived with the brutal efficiency of a ticking time bomb. Inside his sprawling mansion, Brandon sat at his glass dining table, completely ignoring the expensive breakfast Megan had ordered. A severe delinquency notice from his luxury mortgage lender sat squarely in front of him. The heavy red lettering declared his account catastrophically past due. The phantom funds he relied upon had vanished without a single trace. For 36 consecutive months, the anonymous wire transfer had perfectly covered his exorbitant housing costs, masking his total financial failure. Now the account balance read 0. Brandon panicked, his breath catching in his throat as the walls of his fake empire began to close in. He frantically refreshed his banking application on his phone, praying it was a simple technological error, but the screen delivered the same ruthless truth. He called his private wealth manager, pacing back and forth across the imported marble floor, demanding an immediate explanation. The manager calmly informed him that the primary external trust had been permanently liquidated and irrevocably closed. Brandon screamed into the receiver, completely unaware that his parasite father was the invisible benefactor who had kept his fraudulent luxury life afloat all these years. He threw his phone against the leather sofa, his heart racing with genuine terror. Without that specific monthly capital, he could not pay the dealership staff the utility bills or the car loans. The threat of immediate foreclosure loomed over him like an executioner. Megan walked into the room complaining loudly about a minor flaw in her designer dress, entirely blind to the financial apocalypse unfolding right in front of her. Brandon stared at her, feeling the crushing weight of his impending bankruptcy. He had to find massive capital immediately to prevent total ruin. In his desperate mind, there was only one remaining target. He grabbed his keys, formulating a reckless plan to extract every last cent from the man he despised the most. He believed his father was a weak, vulnerable target, waiting to be entirely drained. He decided to strike immediately and ruthlessly before he lost absolutely everything he truly cared about in this shallow and completely meaningless, superficial, broken world he had built. My phone rang sharply as I sat at my wooden desk. The caller identification displayed Brandon's name. I accepted the call, fully anticipating a belated apology for the public assault at the party. Instead, he offered absolutely no apology whatsoever. He did not ask how I felt. He barked a frantic, aggressive order directly into the receiver. He demanded that I drive downtown immediately and sign over the deed to my modest house so he could liquidate the property for emergency business capital. He claimed his dealership faced a sudden operational deficit and insisted that as his father it was my absolute duty to sacrifice my only home to protect his flawless reputation. He spoke with sickening entitlement, treating my entire life sanctuary as a mere asset waiting to be plundered. I listened to his manic breathing on the other end of the line. I let his arrogant commands hang in the silent air between us. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I delivered a flat, uncompromising refusal. I told him my house belonged to me, and I would never sacrifice a single shingle to fund his chaotic mistakes. The silence on his end quickly transformed into pure, unadulterated rage. He could not comprehend that the man he had verbally decimated the night before possessed the spine to deny him. He ordered me again, raising his voice to a hysterical scream demanding immediate compliance. I remained an immovable wall of stone. I informed him that his financial disasters were entirely his own creation, and I would not throw my security into the burning fire of his profound incompetence. His sheer desperation finally snapped his arrogant composure into pure, threatening, and unforgivable verbal venom directed straight at me. Enraged by my absolute rejection, Brandon resorted to a strategy of sheer terror. He screamed that my stubborn refusal proved I was suffering from severe dementia. He explicitly threatened to have me forcibly committed to a state psychiatric ward and legally seize my assets if I did not sign the documents by noon. He vowed to lock me in a sterile room and throw away the key. I did not dignify his unhinged threat with a single response. I firmly pressed the end call button and placed the phone face down on the wooden desk, severing his connection. The absolute audacity of his violent ultimatum solidified my total resolve to dismantle his life. I stood up and walked down the quiet hallway to retrieve some architectural blueprints from my home study. The midday sunlight filtered through the large oak trees outside, casting intricate patterns across the hardwood floor. As I stepped into the room, a sudden sharp draft of cold air brushed against my face. I stopped in my tracks. My eyes scanned the perimeter of the room and landed directly on the heavy oak window frame. The solid brass window latch, which I always kept securely locked, had been expertly pried open from the outside. Deep scratch marks scarred the polished wood, revealing the pale timber beneath. The violation of my private sanctuary was glaringly obvious. A brand new enemy had successfully breached my carefully guarded perimeter. The war had officially crossed the threshold of my own home today. I calmly booted up my secure laptop. Years of managing high-security government contracts taught me to never leave a perimeter unmonitored. I typed in the encrypted password to the concealed camera system I had installed shortly after Diane passed away. The high-definition color footage loaded onto the screen instantly. The timestamp showed the breach occurred merely an hour ago. I watched in absolute silence as Megan forced her petite frame through the study window. Her designer heels clicked against the hardwood floor, echoing a profound disrespect for the house she wanted to steal. She moved with frantic, entitled energy. She went straight for my heavy filing cabinets. She yanked the drawers open, tossing decades of my meticulous civil engineering blueprints onto the floor like garbage. I watched her perfectly manicured hands sift through my personal files until she found my original Social Security documents. She shoved the papers into her expensive leather handbag with a greedy smile. Her eyes then locked onto the vintage cedar jewelry box resting on the top shelf. That box held Diane's antique pearl necklace, a family heirloom passed down through 4 generations of resilient black women. It was the exact necklace Diane wore on our wedding day. Megan did not hesitate to desecrate it. She grabbed the delicate velvet case, her eyes wide with the absolute thrill of the theft, and awkwardly climbed right back out the window. She treated my sacred memories like a petty cash register. I did not feel an ounce of panic. My heart maintained a slow, steady rhythm. The enemy had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a sleek digital tracking tablet. My brilliant wife always deeply appreciated my obsessive need for establishing invisible structural fail-safes against predators. I deliberately kept my phone in my pocket. A lesser man would have frantically dialed the police, immediately screaming about a home invasion. I knew better. Rushing a structural demolition always leaves incredibly dangerous debris. I needed a clean, absolute collapse. Years ago, anticipating the worst of human nature, I had embedded a microscopic GPS tracker directly into the thick velvet lining of Diane's jewelry box. I activated the tablet screen. A bright red digital dot blinked to life against the map of the city. I watched the beacon move rapidly down the interstate, tracking Megan's exact escape route. The dot bypassed the upscale shopping districts she usually frequented and headed straight toward the grittier industrial side of town. It came to a sudden halt on a street corner known for predatory cash exchange businesses. The establishment was notorious for turning a blind eye to origins. I zoomed in on the map coordinates. She had parked right outside a high-end pawn shop that catered to desperate people looking to liquidate stolen assets quietly. I sat back in my leather chair, visualizing the pathetic transaction occurring in real time. Megan was standing at a dirty glass counter, trading a priceless piece of my family history for a stack of fast, untraceable cash to desperately fund her superficial lifestyle. She probably thought she was incredibly clever, completely unaware that she was weaving her own financial noose. My civil engineering career taught me that every bridge needs stress testing before you apply the full weight of the load. Megan had just stress tested my patience and failed catastrophically. I downloaded the entire tracking log and exported the high-definition security video onto an encrypted flash drive. I placed the small silver drive into my jacket pocket. It was time to introduce the raw evidence to a man who understood the precise mechanics of total legal slaughter. Jonathan Pierce was not just an attorney. He was an apex predator wearing a tailored suit, a man I kept on a heavy retainer for exactly this kind of crisis. I grabbed my keys and departed. I drove my rusted truck into the underground parking garage of the most expensive high-rise corporate building in the city. Jonathan Pierce's private office occupied the entire penthouse floor. I bypassed the receptionist, walked straight through the heavy mahogany doors, and tossed the silver flash drive directly onto his pristine glass desk. Jonathan did not ask any pointless questions. He simply plugged the drive into his secure monitor and watched the footage in absolute calculating silence. I watched his sharp eyes track Megan's every movement as she pried open my window and rummaged through my private files. When the video finally ended, Jonathan folded his hands and looked at me with a cold, professional understanding. I leaned forward and delivered my instructions without a single trace of emotion. I told him I did not want a simple police report or a basic slap on the wrist. I wanted a massive, inescapable legal net woven so tightly around Megan and Brandon that they would suffocate the moment I pulled the strings. Jonathan nodded slowly, a dark, brilliant smile creeping across his face. He assured me he would deploy his absolute best financial investigators to track the stolen Social Security documents immediately. He promised to construct a labyrinth of federal charges and civil liabilities that would financially paralyze them before they even knew they were under attack. I demanded absolute, flawless perfection from every single member of his team. The enemy had to be trapped completely before I initiated the final devastating strike. Jonathan picked up his heavy desk phone, dialed his lead private investigator, and set the silent, brutal ambush into motion. I sat in the leather armchair facing the vast window, watching the city skyline darken as afternoon faded into early evening. Jonathan stepped out of the room to confer with his forensic accounting team. When he returned, his expression was grim, holding a stack of freshly printed financial dossiers. He placed the heavy documents on the table. The discovery was absolutely devastating. Megan had not just stolen the documents to hold them hostage, she had weaponized them immediately. Jonathan explained that within hours of the intrusion, she had successfully used my stolen identity to open 3 separate platinum credit cards. The detailed ledgers showed a frantic, vulgar shopping spree across high-end digital boutiques and luxury travel agencies. She had systematically maxed out all 3 cards, accumulating exactly $50,000 in fraudulent debt under my name. The sheer velocity of her theft proved a desperate, reckless greed that overrode any basic human caution. She believed my age made me an easy, oblivious target. She thought I would simply absorb the damage quietly to protect my son. She was entirely wrong. Before Jonathan could outline the process for filing federal identity theft charges, my personal cell phone buzzed. My home security system alerted me to a presence on my front porch. A heavy, aggressive knock pounded against my front door. I checked the live camera feed on my phone screen. A severe-looking process server stood on my porch clutching a manila folder. He was delivering a formal court summons for an emergency high-priority commercial debt collection. The financial hemorrhage had officially breached my walls, demanding immediate, decisive retaliation. I held the heavy court summons in my hand, staring at the fraudulent $50,000 debt Megan had anchored to my name. I did not waste a single second indulging in anger. I drove my rusted truck directly to the primary branch of the national bank where the fraudulent platinum cards originated. I bypassed the standard teller lines and walked straight into the regional manager's glass office, placing the legal subpoena flat on his mahogany desk. The manager looked up, ready to offer a rehearsed corporate apology. I silenced him by sliding my encrypted tablet across the desk, pressing play on the high-definition security footage. He watched my daughter-in-law violently ransack my private study and steal my Social Security documents with a sickening smile. I explained the exact timeline of the identity theft and the resulting financial hemorrhage. The manager turned completely pale, instantly recognizing the massive institutional liability staring him in the face. He immediately accessed the bank's mainframe and initiated a hard lock on my legitimate personal accounts, creating an impenetrable firewall around my true assets. He then followed my precise instructions regarding the fraudulent credit lines. We officially flagged the accounts for an aggressive federal wire fraud investigation. We deliberately left the credit accounts open and active in the system, turning them into a digital bear trap. Megan believed she possessed unlimited access to a limitless well of stolen money. She was completely unaware that every subsequent transaction she made was now generating an automatic time-stamped federal felony alert. I walked out of the heavy bank doors with my financial perimeter perfectly secured. The trap was set, but the enemy was already preparing her next devastating public strike against me. Megan was entirely unaware of the invisible, catastrophic federal net slowly closing around her stolen wealth. Operating under a delusion of total invincibility, she prepared a ruthless digital execution. Sitting in the plush comfort of her expansive living room, she uploaded the horrific video of the anniversary party to her massive social media following. The unedited footage already showed Brandon driving his finger into my chest 9 times, but raw reality was never enough for her manipulative narratives. She maliciously edited the clip, splicing the video to remove Brandon's unhinged screaming completely. Instead, she manipulated the audio and slowed down my deliberate silence, overlaying dramatic, somber music to manufacture a completely false reality. She meticulously crafted the visual narrative to make my calm demeanor appear aggressive, unstable, and dangerously senile. She deliberately framed herself and Brandon as the deeply traumatized, weeping victims of a toxic, unpredictable father who was actively ruining their perfect, hard-earned lives. She typed a lengthy, tear-soaked caption detailing her completely fabricated emotional suffering, begging her followers for prayers and public support against my supposed elder tyranny. Within minutes, the maliciously edited video ignited across the digital landscape like wildfire. Her loyal army of followers consumed the lies, instantly flooding the comment section with absolute venom directed squarely at me. They called for my immediate institutionalization, entirely ignorant of the fact that the weeping victim on their screens was a felon actively bleeding her father-in-law dry. Megan watched the view count multiply into the millions, savoring the massive influx of undeserved sympathy. She genuinely believed she had utterly destroyed my reputation and silenced me forever through the power of public shame. She sat back on her expensive couch, holding the very smartphone purchased with my stolen funds, convinced her malicious public narrative would break my spirit. She did not understand that a civil engineer never fears the superficial wind blowing against the solid concrete. She thought she had buried me alive under a mountain of public outrage. She was now completely and utterly oblivious to the devastating reality that her loud, arrogant victory dance was merely the precursor to her absolute, inescapable ruin approaching swiftly. A brutal wave of public vitriol violently crashed over me by the next morning. The fabricated viral video dominated local community forums and professional networks. My pristine reputation was suddenly shredded by an army of absolute strangers operating purely on manipulated emotions. When I walked down my driveway to check, the male neighbors whispered harshly behind drawn curtains, shooting me glares filled with overt disgust. Former colleagues and distant relatives sent me deeply concerned, pitying texts urging me to seek immediate psychiatric help before I truly hurt someone. The sheer volume of the public backlash was designed to force a frantic, disorganized retreat. I absorbed the heavy public shame without defending myself or uttering a single word of justification. I knew engaging with the fabricated outrage would only feed the fire they wanted to stoke. Instead of arguing with ghosts on the internet, I maintained my absolute silence and poured my focused energy into a devastating counteroffensive. I instructed Jonathan Pierce to officially draft an aggressive defamation lawsuit alongside the sprawling federal wire fraud case. Every single malicious comment, every shared video, and every vitriolic text message was meticulously documented and archived by his elite legal team. Megan was actively wrapping her own neck in a heavy legal chain of libel while celebrating her digital victory. I sat quietly in my study drinking bitter black coffee, entirely undisturbed by the loud digital circus screaming for my head. I knew the truth was a slow, crushing machine. A sudden, aggressively jarring noise from right outside the window shattered the quiet morning, demanding my absolute attention instantly. I stood up from my heavy wooden desk and moved silently toward the large front window. A sleek, intimidating black sedan had aggressively pulled into my gravel driveway, crushing the dry autumn leaves under its thick tires. The luxury vehicle sat idling like a predatory beast right outside my front door. Brandon stepped out of the driver's seat wearing a sharp, expensive suit and a deeply arrogant scowl. He adjusted his silk tie, fully projecting the completely fabricated image of a deeply concerned, wealthy son forced to handle an unfortunate family tragedy. A strange, much shorter man emerged from the passenger side immediately after him. The stranger wore a cheap, ill-fitting beige suit and carried a scuffed leather medical briefcase tightly against his chest. His posture was inherently nervous, a stark contrast to Brandon's overly aggressive swagger. They did not pause to survey the property or ring the doorbell politely. They marched directly toward my front door with hostile, militaristic purpose, fully intending to physically execute the vicious threat of institutionalization they had promised me the day before. Brandon planned to drag me out of my own home, strip away my legal autonomy, and lock me inside a sterile psychiatric ward to gain immediate, uncontested access to my hidden millions. I watched them approach through the glass, noting the heavy folder of fraudulent medical documents clutched tightly in Brandon's right hand. He was coming to erase me from existence permanently to cure his financial rot. I did not lock the solid front door or call for any outside police help. I stood directly in the center of the narrow hallway, actively waiting to shatter his arrogant, pathetic illusion of absolute control face to face. Brandon shoved the heavy front door open without bothering to knock, marching into the narrow hallway with the aggressive entitlement of a man who believed he already owned the floorboards beneath his feet. The stranger in the cheap beige suit followed closely behind him, clutching the scuffed leather briefcase tightly like a shield. Brandon did not offer a polite greeting. He immediately cornered me in my own living room and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He declared loudly that my irrational financial decisions and hostile behavior proved I was no longer capable of living independently. He introduced the nervous stranger as Dr. Eris Thorne, an official psychiatric evaluator appointed by the state to rapidly assess my deteriorating mental competency. The man opened his briefcase and produced a thick stack of complex medical documents. He began firing off manipulative leading questions designed to completely disorient and trap me. He asked if I frequently forgot where I placed my keys, if I experienced sudden bouts of unprovoked anger, and if my recent financial choices felt confusing or overwhelmingly stressful. Every single question was a calculated snare intended to manufacture a completely false medical narrative of severe senile dementia. Brandon stood directly behind the actor, radiating impatient malice. He pulled a separate document from his tailored jacket pocket and slammed it violently down onto my coffee table. It was a comprehensive medical power of attorney. He handed me a cold silver pen and demanded an immediate signature, screaming that this was my absolute last chance to handle my mental decline privately before he dragged me into a brutal public courtroom. He promised that if I signed the papers right now, he would graciously allow me to choose my own assisted living facility. I looked at the cold silver pen, then at the trembling doctor, and finally at my completely unhinged, greedy son. I completely ignored the silver pen resting on the glass table and focused my entire attention on the supposed medical professional standing awkwardly in my living room. I stepped considerably closer to the stranger, forcing him to look me directly in the wide eyes. I demanded to see his official state medical identification badge before I answered a single question regarding my cognitive health. The man hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward Brandon for permission, before fumbling awkwardly with his coat pocket. He produced a laminated plastic card attached to a cheap blue lanyard and held it out with visibly shaking hands. I stared at the printed credentials with extreme focus. My entire long professional career as a senior civil engineer involved drafting and executing massive load-bearing structural contracts for regional hospital networks. I spent decades walking through high-security medical wards, deeply familiarizing myself with every rigorous administrative protocol and security measure required by the state health department. The identification badge in front of me was an absolute laughable forgery. The printed font was slightly misaligned, the official state seal was a blurry, low-resolution copy, and most importantly, the plastic card completely lacked the specific embedded multi-layered security holograms that were legally mandated for all active psychiatric evaluators operating within our current jurisdiction. The man standing in my living room was not a true doctor. He was a desperate, cheap actor hired directly off the street to perform a highly illegal medical charade. Brandon had actually paid a common civilian to violently invade my home and forcefully intimidate me into surrendering my total legal autonomy. My son genuinely believed I was a blind, ignorant old fool who would simply collapse under the intimidating weight of a fake authority figure. He fundamentally misunderstood the meticulous, highly analytical nature of the man who raised him. I did not step back, blink, or show any visible fear. I stood my ground and committed every single minute detail of the actor's terrified face and fraudulent badge to my permanent memory, silently preparing to quickly spring a devastating counterattack. I turned my back on the fraudulent doctor, deliberately taking my time, and calmly walked over to my very heavy, solid mahogany desk. I unlocked the bottom drawer and extracted a thick sealed envelope bearing the authentic watermarked crest of the State Neurological Institute's testing division. I pulled out a certified date-stamped cognitive evaluation form and dropped it firmly onto the glass coffee table right next to Brandon's entirely worthless power of attorney document. I informed them both that I had preemptively visited the chief neurologist at the Central Hospital merely 2 short days prior. The comprehensive medical report confirmed that I possessed a flawless cognitive score, absolutely and completely refuting any possibility of senile dementia or sudden mental decline. Brandon stared at the official hospital seals in sheer, paralyzing horror as his entire malicious extortion plot evaporated right before his eyes. I then reached out and tapped the small, black dictaphone resting inconspicuously beside a stack of engineering books on the nearby wooden shelf. The solid red light blinked steadily, indicating that every single word spoken in the room had been recorded in crisp, high-definition audio. I looked directly at the terrified actor and informed him that he had just committed felony medical impersonation, attempted elder extortion, and conspiracy to commit federal fraud across state lines. I promised him that my ruthless legal team would gladly hand the pristine audio recording directly to the federal prosecutor before the sun set tonight. I gave the stranger exactly 10 seconds to exit my property before I locked the doors and summoned the local police to arrest him for the violent home invasion. The actor turned completely pale, dropping his fake medical documents all over the floor as sheer panic flooded his wide, terrified eyes. The fake doctor did not waste a single second attempting to defend himself or retrieve his scattered papers. He spun around and sprinted out the front door in absolute terror, practically running down the gravel driveway to escape the impending federal charges. Brandon stood completely alone in the center of my living room, stripped of his hired muscle and thoroughly outsmarted, his face contorted into a dark mask of pure, humiliated fury. Realizing his intimidation tactic had failed catastrophically, he grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the side table and hurled it violently against the brick fireplace. The expensive glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces across the stone hearth. He screamed a string of vile curses at me before storming out of the house, slamming the heavy front door with enough force to rattle the window panes. I did not flinch at the violent display. I simply grabbed a broom and swept up the broken glass in total silence. 2 hours later, the stillness of the house was broken by a secure phone call from Jonathan Pierce. His voice carried a grim, razor-sharp urgency. Brandon had not retreated to lick his wounds. Instead, he had gone straight to a deeply corrupt civil judge. Jonathan informed me that Brandon had formally filed an emergency ex parte motion for temporary conservatorship using his own completely fabricated testimony to declare me an immediate danger to myself. The legal war had officially escalated to its most dangerous level. The corrupt legal maneuver initiated by Brandon succeeded with frightening speed. A notoriously sympathetic county judge, swayed entirely by the fabricated medical narratives and the carefully orchestrated urgency of the ex parte motion, signed the temporary conservatorship order. By early morning, the ruling took devastating effect. The bank executed an immediate freeze on all my personal checking and savings accounts. The financial lockdown was absolute, severing my daily operating funds without warning or due process. As I sat in my quiet kitchen holding the official bank notification, my cell phone rang brightly. I answered the call, fully expecting to hear the arrogant voice of my son. Instead, Megan spoke. Her tone dripped with venomous, unchecked malice. She did not bother to feign concern for my health or justify the legal assault. She called strictly to gloat over my manufactured demise. She proudly declared that they legally owned my entire life now. She casually informed me that contractors were already booked for the following Tuesday to gut my home. She explicitly promised to tear out the master bedroom where Diane and I had spent 30 years of our lives together. Megan stated she was going to convert that sacred space into her brand new custom walk-in closet by the end of the week. She reveled in her cruelty, painting a vivid picture of my immediate future locked away in a bleak state facility while she paraded her stolen wealth across my hardwood floors. She demanded to know how it felt to finally be put exactly in my place by my betters. She waited eagerly for my loud, angry reaction. She desperately wanted me to scream and validate the entire fabricated narrative of my unstable, dangerous mind. I absolutely refused to give her a single drop of satisfaction today. I listened to her hollow, vicious, arrogant laughter echo through the small speaker of my mobile device. I did not utter a single word of defense or offer any emotional response. I pulled the phone away from my ear and calmly pressed the button to disconnect the call. I sat alone in the profound darkness of my quiet study, surrounded by the heavy silence of the empty house. The fading evening sunset cast long, dark, intimidating shadows across the pristine hardwood floors of my private sanctuary. My adversaries genuinely believed they had successfully crippled my entire operation by cutting off my basic access to personal liquidity. They were celebrating a superficial victory, completely blind to the terrifying depth of the foundations I had built over 40 long years. I mentally evaluated the massive hidden arsenal at my immediate disposal. It was true that my small personal checking accounts and standard retirement funds were now completely frozen under the fraudulent court order. I could not buy a simple cup of coffee using my own debit card. However, my vast corporate entities remained entirely untouched, completely anonymous, and incredibly lethal. When Diane and I initially structured our massive commercial real estate portfolio, we deliberately isolated the holding companies from our individual identities. We utilized layers of blind trusts, remote shell corporations, and ironclad proxy executives to mask the true ownership of the empire. Brandon had spent his entire life obsessing over loud, flashy displays of wealth, completely ignoring the quiet, invisible mechanics of true financial power. He had recklessly attacked the fragile decoy while ignoring the massive fortress heavily armed right behind it. I did not need my personal savings to completely annihilate him. The time for defensive posturing had permanently ended. I stood up from my leather chair, perfectly calm and deeply focused. I quickly grabbed my cold metal car keys from the edge of the large, smooth wooden table. The engine of my retaliation was fully primed and ready to ignite. I was ready to unleash the full, devastating weight of the massive invisible empire upon his incredibly fragile, heavily indebted world. I drove through the desolate streets of the sleeping city, pulling into the private underground parking garage of Jonathan Pierce's corporate building long before dawn broke. The air was crisp and extremely cold. Jonathan was already waiting for me inside his expansive, dimly lit penthouse office. He had a fresh pot of black coffee brewing and a towering stack of heavily redacted legal binders organized perfectly across his expansive glass desk. We sat down together and officially activated the formidable legal persona of Wright Holdings, LLC. This was the highly secretive primary shell company that Diane and I had meticulously constructed decades ago. It silently owned and ruthlessly managed over half the premium commercial real estate located in the most lucrative district of the entire city. For years, I had operated purely as a silent, benevolent ghost behind the corporate curtain. That passive era was completely finished today. I reached for the sleek silver pen resting on the desk and pulled a specific, heavily detailed property file toward me. I flipped past the dense legal jargon and stared directly at the formal commercial lease agreement governing the exact plot of prime real estate, where Brandon currently operated his wildly successful, highly arrogant luxury car dealership. My son genuinely believed he leased that million-dollar showroom from a massive, faceless international conglomerate. He had absolutely no idea that his own father held the absolute power to crush his entire business into dust with a single stroke of ink. I boldly signed my name at the bottom of the aggressive, strictly enforced corporate directive. The newly signed severe legal order instantly initiated the sudden absolute termination of his massive commercial lease, based firmly on explicitly documented ethical violations and severe moral turpitude. The irreversible, highly devastating trap was set and firmly locked. By morning, the massive showroom of Brandon's luxury dealership was buzzing with wealthy clients and aggressive salesmen. Brandon stood near a gleaming, imported sports car, loudly boasting to a potential buyer about his incredible business acumen and unmatched industry success. A uniformed corporate courier wearing a dark suit walked directly through the heavy glass doors, entirely ignoring the receptionist. The courier approached Brandon, completely interrupting his arrogant sales pitch, and handed him a thick, certified legal envelope bearing the intimidating gold seal of Wright Holdings, LLC. Brandon snatched the envelope with extreme irritation, annoyed by the sudden disruption of his performance. He tore open the heavy seal and quickly scanned the dense legal text printed on the crisp white paper. The blood drained completely from his face in a matter of seconds. The document was a brutal, inflexible termination of his commercial property lease, explicitly citing severe moral turpitude and undeniable ethical violations as the unchallengeable grounds for immediate eviction. The heavy jargon offered absolutely no room for appeal, negotiation, or extension. He stared at the bold, unforgiving ink at the bottom of the page, unable to process the catastrophic reality. The invisible corporate landlord had suddenly awakened to strip him of his entire physical kingdom. The final paragraph delivered the most devastating blow. Brandon had exactly 7 days to vacate the massive premises, remove his expensive inventory, and surrender the keys before armed federal marshals forcibly dragged him out. The solid ground began to violently tremble beneath his feet. Brandon stared at the crisp white document bearing the gold seal of Wright Holdings, LLC. The bold legal font outlined a catastrophic reality that his arrogant mind completely refused to process. The eviction notice mandated a total surrender of the massive commercial property within exactly 7 days. The underlying crisis extended far beyond losing a physical building. Brandon knew the ruthless stipulations of his international luxury franchise agreements perfectly well. The moment he lost the verified high-security showroom, his lucrative supplier contracts became completely and immediately void. He would have absolutely nothing to sell. He frantically grabbed his expensive desk phone and dialed the elite property management firm listed at the bottom of the termination letter. A cold, highly trained corporate receptionist answered the line. Brandon dropped his usual smooth, charismatic sales persona and immediately resorted to desperate begging. He demanded an emergency meeting with the invisible owner of the holding company. He promised to pay double the current rent, offering massive, impossible cash bonuses just to keep the physical doors open. He rambled about his flawless reputation and his massive upcoming sales projections. The receptionist listened to his manic pleading with absolute clinical apathy. She calmly informed him that Wright Holdings, LLC operated under strict, inflexible executive directives regarding moral turpitude. She stated firmly that the invisible owner had absolutely zero interest in negotiating with a man of his profoundly flawed character. Before Brandon could scream another empty threat, she abruptly disconnected the line. A sharp dial tone echoed loudly in his spacious, glass-walled office. He slammed the receiver down, his perfectly manicured hands trembling with a sudden icy terror. He turned his head and looked through the glass partition just as the ultimate nightmare officially rolled directly onto his highly polished, immaculate dealership lot exactly at this very moment. A fleet of heavy industrial flatbed tow trucks aggressively breached the perimeter of the luxury dealership lot. The massive diesel engines roared loudly, completely drowning out the soft classical music playing over the outdoor speaker system. International suppliers, notified instantly by the legally binding corporate lease termination, had dispatched their recovery teams with ruthless efficiency. They carried strict legal orders to aggressively reclaim every single piece of high-end inventory before the physical property was officially locked down. Brandon sprinted out of his office in absolute panic, violently waving his arms and screaming at the grim-faced recovery agents to immediately halt the loading process. The men ignored his frantic commands entirely. They efficiently attached heavy steel chains to the axles of gleaming imported sports cars, dragging the multi-million-dollar assets violently onto the rusted steel ramps. Megan emerged from the customer lounge, wearing an expensive designer dress she had just purchased using my stolen funds. Realizing her superficial kingdom was rapidly dissolving, she completely lost her mind. She shrieked hysterically at the terrified dealership staff, blaming the innocent receptionists and terrified salesmen for the sudden catastrophic collapse. She threw a heavy promotional brochure directly at a bewildered mechanic before collapsing onto a leather chair in a dramatic weeping fit. Brandon furiously checked his corporate banking application on his smartphone, praying for a sudden miracle. The digital screen displayed a devastating chain of cascading failures. Without the massive showroom facility to fulfill his rigid franchise obligations, his primary corporate lenders had instantly triggered a severe default clause. His massive operating accounts rapidly drained down to absolute zero right before his horrified eyes. The automated red digits confirmed his total, unmitigated financial destruction. He suddenly realized he was facing an inescapable, completely unavoidable, personal and professional bankruptcy within exactly 72 hours. The walls of his fake empire were entirely crushed. He knew he desperately needed a massive, immediate injection of raw cash to barely survive this brutal corporate execution today. He ran toward his vehicle, completely abandoning his weeping wife to face the terrifying music alone. Brandon drove his luxury sedan wildly through the residential streets, aggressively ignoring the speed limits until he aggressively skidded into my driveway. The tires threw loose gravel across the dry lawn. He practically ripped the car door open and marched directly up the front steps. I was waiting for him, standing firmly in the open doorway. He completely abandoned the arrogant theatrical pretense of the medical conservatorship. He did not bring another fake doctor or wave fraudulent documents in my face. The absolute terror of imminent poverty had forcefully stripped away his manufactured aristocratic mask. He stormed into the living room, sweating profusely, his expensive silk tie hanging loosely around his neck. He practically begged and demanded simultaneously. He ordered me to immediately hand over the original physical deed to the family house. He yelled that he desperately needed my unencumbered property to hastily secure a massive bridge loan from an aggressive private lender. He genuinely acted as if his entire survival was my direct personal responsibility. He screamed that I absolutely owed him this fundamental sacrifice because I was his father and his massive dealership was simply far too important to let fail. He paced wildly across my hardwood floor, demanding that I sign the necessary transfer paperwork before the banks permanently locked his access to capital. I watched his manic, pathetic display of sheer entitlement without showing a single trace of sympathy. He had publicly labeled me a worthless parasite just days prior, yet he now expected me to sever my only safety net to patch his sinking ship. I did not verbally respond to his unhinged, frantic demands. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket to present a completely different set of highly damaging financial documents today. I pulled 3 freshly printed, highly detailed platinum credit card statements from my inner jacket pocket. I placed the severe documents face up on the glass coffee table, completely covering his arrogant shadow. I firmly pointed a steady finger directly at the massive, fraudulent $50,000 balance printed aggressively in bold red ink. I looked into his panicked, bloodshot eyes and demanded a clear, immediate explanation for his wife's blatant felony theft. I presented the absolute proof of her breaking into my secure home, stealing my private identity, and maliciously maxing out fraudulent lines of credit in a matter of hours. Instead of showing an ounce of shame or horror at his wife's criminal actions, Brandon violently doubled down on his extreme entitlement. He actually defended Megan's massive grand larceny. He yelled forcefully that the stolen $50,000 was simply justified back pay. He claimed they fundamentally deserved every single stolen penny for enduring the terrible burden of dealing with an old, useless, parasitic man. He completely refused to acknowledge the heavy legal reality bearing down on his life. His grotesque lack of basic morality finally extinguished the very last lingering ember of paternal mercy buried deep inside my chest. He viewed my total destruction as his inherent birthright. I looked at the vicious monster pacing across my floor and fully accepted the cold truth. I decided right then and there to decisively end their reign of terror entirely. I would strictly ensure they faced absolute, permanent, inescapable legal and financial ruin very swiftly without any hesitation today. I left Brandon standing in my living room, completely ignoring his arrogant shouts, and walked straight out the front door to my truck. I drove directly to the federal police precinct downtown, bypassing the local authorities entirely. I walked into the heavy concrete building and requested an immediate meeting with the Financial Crimes Division. A seasoned federal investigator sat across from me in a stark, brightly lit interrogation room. I did not waste time with emotional appeals or family history. I placed the encrypted flash drive containing the high-definition security footage of Megan invading my home alongside the towering stack of fraudulent platinum credit card statements directly on his metal desk. I formally filed aggressive charges of severe identity theft, extensive wire fraud, and grand larceny against my own daughter-in-law. The investigator reviewed the undeniable digital trail showing Megan systematically draining exactly $50,000 across various digital boutiques and luxury travel agencies. He meticulously verified the dates, the times, and the fraudulent signatures anchoring the debt to my stolen Social Security number. The sheer velocity and massive volume of the theft immediately triggered federal interest. The investigator firmly stated that the severe financial damage combined with multiple clear violations of interstate commerce laws from her frantic online shopping spree elevated the crime far beyond a simple domestic dispute. He officially escalated the criminal file to the absolute top of the active federal docket before I even left the building. Federal arrest warrants were drafted immediately. The brutal government machine was now fully activated and completely locked onto Megan. She had proudly flaunted her stolen wealth, completely unaware that every single luxury purchase had provided the government with an exact map to her absolute ruin. I walked out of the precinct with a signed copy of the formal criminal complaint securely in hand. The trap I had carefully constructed was springing shut. 3 unmarked federal cruisers silently arrived at Brandon's sprawling luxury mansion just after dusk. The flashing blue and red lights aggressively cut through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, signaling the absolute end of Megan's stolen lifestyle. Heavily armed officers marched briskly up the manicured stone pathway and pounded forcefully on the massive front doors. When no one answered, they swiftly executed the authorized search warrant, breaching the secure perimeter to retrieve the stolen goods. They rapidly spread out across the pristine marble-floored foyer and successfully cornered Megan in the lavishly decorated dining room. She was fully dressed in expensive designer clothes explicitly purchased with my defrauded money. Instead of showing any remorse or surrendering peacefully to the undeniable legal authority standing firmly in her own home, Megan instantly initiated a chaotic, highly theatrical meltdown. She violently resisted arrest, aggressively pushing back against the advancing federal agents while wildly thrashing her arms. She frantically pulled out her expensive smartphone and immediately began to live stream the entire tense encounter to her massive devoted social media audience. She held the camera high, capturing the severe faces of the federal officers as they firmly ordered her to stand down and comply with the active warrant. She completely ignored their explicit legal commands and aggressively screamed directly into the digital lens. She wailed hysterically to her millions of followers that her abusive, deranged father-in-law was actively bribing corrupt police officers to maliciously harass a completely innocent, suffering woman. She demanded immediate public outrage, frantically painting herself as a helpless martyr, violently targeted by a wealthy, senile tyrant. She loudly shrieked that her fundamental rights were being brutally violated in real time, desperately hoping her loyal digital army would quickly launch a massive counterattack to magically save her. The federal agents remained completely unimpressed by her pathetic, unhinged digital performance. They moved forward decisively to firmly secure the vast premises and formally execute the highly severe federal arrest warrant against her physical person immediately without any further delay whatsoever. The dramatic livestream initially achieved the exact manipulative reaction Megan desperately craved. The digital community rapidly mobilized, instantly flooding the chaotic video feed with furious comments, demanding immediate justice against me for supposedly traumatizing an innocent family. The unverified outrage exploded exponentially across multiple social platforms, momentarily painting Megan as a brave, persecuted victim fighting a corrupt system. However, the superficial victory lasted exactly 7 minutes. Jonathan Pierce and his elite legal team were actively monitoring the digital landscape, waiting for the perfect moment to counterattack. They simultaneously released the undeniable high-definition security footage directly to the public forums. The pristine, unedited video clearly showed Megan violently prying open my study window and aggressively ransacking my private files. They flawlessly paired the home intrusion footage with the incredibly damning surveillance video retrieved directly from the seedy pawn shop. The public watched in absolute, undeniable horror as Megan casually stood at a dirty glass counter greedily selling Diane's sacred antique pearl necklace for a stack of untraceable cash. The undeniable visual proof of her vicious, premeditated felony theft completely shattered her fragile, fabricated narrative of innocence. The vast public tide violently and instantly turned against them. The millions of followers who had just viciously defended her suddenly realized they had been entirely manipulated by a ruthless, lying criminal. The comment section immediately transformed into a brutal execution block. The furious digital mob unleashed an unstoppable avalanche of absolute disgust, burying both Brandon and Megan under a massive mountain of inescapable public shame. Her manipulative weapon had completely backfired, entirely destroying her carefully curated reputation forever. They were now permanently branded as absolute monsters across every single digital screen globally, sealing their ultimate social death completely. Brandon watched his entire perfectly constructed world disintegrate into absolute nothingness in a matter of hours. He was completely stripped of all unearned public sympathy and permanently severed from his lucrative dealership franchise. The devastating reality of Megan's imminent, inescapable federal incarceration completely shattered his arrogant mind. He desperately needed a massive, instant injection of raw, untraceable cash to secure a high-profile criminal defense attorney and simultaneously prevent his remaining personal assets from violently imploding. With his traditional corporate credit lines permanently frozen and his public reputation entirely toxic, no legitimate financial institution would ever lend him a single dollar. Driven by pure, unadulterated terror, Brandon made a catastrophic, completely irreversible decision. He frantically dug through his heavy leather briefcase and retrieved the clear, physical copy of my original residential property deed he had previously demanded. He aggressively started his luxury sedan and drove blindly toward the gritty, heavily industrialized sector of the city. He aggressively bypassed the standard pawn shops and drove straight into the shadowy territory controlled by a notoriously violent, entirely unregulated criminal loan shark. He sat at a rusted metal desk opposite a very dangerous man and presented the pristine deed to my fully paid home, without a single ounce of hesitation or basic human conscience. Brandon picked up a cheap pen and meticulously forged my exact signature onto the predatory high-interest collateral contract. He illegally anchored my entire family home to an incredibly violent underworld debt, sealing his absolute final destruction completely. He had foolishly invited pure darkness into his life, guaranteeing his total annihilation without any mercy. The desperate transaction Brandon executed within the city's criminal underbelly was destined to trigger an immediate catastrophic digital avalanche. When Diane and I meticulously structured our vast commercial and residential real estate portfolio decades ago, we actively anticipated the inevitable rise of corporate espionage and sophisticated property fraud. I personally engineered and instituted an aggressive, completely immutable dual authentication protocol legally bound to every single physical property deed bearing my name. The violent, unregulated loan shark Brandon had foolishly partnered with possessed absolutely no knowledge of these invisible advanced structural safeguards. Operating under the arrogant assumption of a quick, highly profitable extortion scheme, the criminal financier confidently attempted to formally register the forged property deed within the central municipal property system to secure his illegal collateral. The second the fraudulent municipal filing breached the heavily encrypted county database, it aggressively collided with my invisible corporate firewall. The sophisticated system automatically locked the unverified transaction in a pending status and instantly triggered a silent, high-priority digital alarm. That precise, undeniable security alert was routed directly to the secured servers located inside Jonathan Pierce's corporate penthouse office. The blinking red notification illuminated Jonathan's pristine glass desk, providing time-stamped proof that a major federal felony was actively occurring. Brandon had convinced himself that dealing with dangerous criminals in the shadows would effectively bypass my traditional banking perimeters. He fundamentally misunderstood that the true power of a meticulously designed engineering system lies in its silent, absolute omniscience. My son had unwittingly handed the most damaging, undeniable piece of physical evidence directly into a sophisticated digital bear trap. He believed he was securing his financial salvation by leveraging my family home, ignorant of the fact that his actions were broadcasting his exact criminal coordinates. Jonathan Pierce immediately grabbed his encrypted mobile device and rapidly dialed my private residential landline. His normally cold, incredibly measured legal voice carried an unmistakable tone of sheer, absolute urgency. He rapidly informed me that a completely unauthorized, highly suspicious financial lien was currently attempting to violently breach the title of my primary physical residence. Jonathan aggressively advised me to formally deploy our vast corporate countermeasures to block the fraudulent municipal transaction, instantly legally halting the illegal property transfer before any permanent damage could physically materialize. He explained that allowing the shady underworld financier to successfully attach a physical lien to my home presented an incredibly severe, fundamentally unnecessary risk. I listened to his frantic, extremely logical legal counsel in total, unwavering silence. I calmly instructed my elite attorney to completely stand down and drop all defensive corporate protocols immediately. I absolutely refused to block the pending criminal action. I deliberately ordered Jonathan to manually override our sophisticated municipal safety nets and willfully allow the dangerous preliminary approval to officially pass directly through the state registry system. Jonathan practically gasped into the phone, deeply shocked by my reckless directive, aggressively warning me that we were actively handing a vicious criminal a fully loaded legal weapon. I sternly reminded him that a beautifully engineered structural collapse requires the target to walk entirely into the deepest center of the impact zone. I did not want to merely stop Brandon from executing a foolish, desperate mistake. I explicitly wanted my unhinged son to fully cross the absolute legal threshold into federal felony forgery without any remaining ambiguity or potential escape routes. By willfully allowing the forged paperwork to officially clear the municipal processing queue, I was permanently transforming his petty familial theft into a devastating, inescapable federal crime carrying mandatory consecutive sentencing. Brandon was gleefully tying the heavy rope tightly around his own neck, completely ignorant of the fact that I was the one willfully supplying him with the extra length. I actively demanded that his absolute total destruction be sealed completely and perfectly today. He was blindly marching straight into an unforgiving concrete wall, and I absolutely refused to offer a parachute. The unchecked forgery immediately provided the desperate couple with exactly what they needed. The unregulated loan shark, operating entirely outside the boundaries of lawful financial oversight, rapidly wired a massive, completely untraceable cash injection directly into Brandon's remaining offshore corporate account. This sudden, highly illegal influx of black market liquidity artificially stabilized their violently collapsing world. Brandon immediately utilized the incredibly toxic funds to aggressively pay Megan's exorbitant, astronomical legal retainers, hiring the absolute most ruthless criminal defense attorneys available in the entire state. He aggressively pushed the remaining stolen capital into his visibly failing commercial operations, desperately attempting to artificially mask the undeniable reality of his complete financial ruin from his terrified, confused investors. The stolen money acted as a powerful, incredibly dangerous narcotic, temporarily numbing the severe structural damage destroying their lives. They sat together on the plush, imported Italian leather sofa inside their sprawling, heavily mortgaged luxury mansion, drinking incredibly expensive vintage champagne purchased with my illegally auctioned property. They clinked their crystal glasses together in a grotesque, completely unearned celebration. Megan smiled arrogantly, her previous manic panic entirely replaced by a sickening, deeply entitled smugness. They genuinely believed they had successfully outsmarted the stubborn, completely useless old man who stubbornly refused to die and yield his wealth. Brandon confidently assured his glowing wife that the temporary commercial lease termination was merely a minor corporate glitch that his expensive lawyers would easily reverse by Monday morning. They felt entirely invincible, wrapped tightly in a thick, comforting blanket of stolen cash and profound delusion. They had absolutely no idea that their temporary, highly illegal relief was merely the calm, silent eye of a massive, inescapable federal hurricane preparing to violently tear their entire fake kingdom apart. Their final moments of peace were numbered. To completely repair their shattered public image and aggressively reassert their manufactured dominance over the social scene, Megan insisted they immediately host a massive high-profile charity gala. She deliberately booked the grand ballroom at the city's absolute most exclusive, incredibly elite restaurant, entirely funding the exorbitant catering deposits and extravagant floral arrangements with the highly illegal loan shark money. She viewed this incredibly vulgar display of stolen wealth as her ultimate public coronation, to ensure her perfect, completely fabricated narrative remained entirely unchallenged. Megan specifically hired aggressive private security contractors to rigidly monitor the velvet ropes. She explicitly banned me from entering the premises, providing the heavily armed guards with my photograph and strict, uncompromising orders to forcibly remove me if I dared to show my face. She genuinely believed that publicly excluding me from this major philanthropic event would definitively prove to the city that I was nothing more than an unstable, entirely irrelevant outcast. She wanted to cement my absolute social exile while proudly wearing a crown funded by my stolen identity. I sat in my quiet, undisturbed study, calmly reviewing the digital invitation Jonathan Pierce had effortlessly intercepted for me. I did not feel an ounce of panic or rejection. I stood up slowly and walked deliberately toward my bedroom. I opened my heavy cedar closet and reached past my standard daily attire. I carefully pulled out my absolute best, flawlessly tailored charcoal suit. I meticulously adjusted my silk tie in the mirror, preparing to completely obliterate their fragile, stolen kingdom. The grand ballroom of the city's most elite restaurant hummed with the arrogant energy of manufactured prestige. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over dozens of impeccably dressed socialites, wealthy investors, and local politicians. At the front of the lavishly decorated hall, Brandon stood behind a polished mahogany podium. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and leaned into the microphone, delivering a deeply tearful, entirely fabricated speech. He spoke with rehearsed emotion about fundamental family values, profound personal sacrifices, and overcoming immense unseen hardships to build his supposed empire. Megan sat at the VIP table right beside the stage, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the devoted, supportive wife to absolute perfection. They had completely convinced the room of their noble suffering and undeniable success. I stood completely still in the dim lighting of the main foyer, perfectly camouflaged by the shadows. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit and took one deep, calculating breath. I stepped forward and gripped the heavy brass handles of the massive oak doors. I pushed them open with a sudden, violent force that echoed loudly over Brandon's amplified voice. The heavy thud of the solid wood hitting the thick marble walls severed the polite applause instantly. Every single head in the vast ballroom turned toward the back entrance simultaneously. I walked straight into the blinding center of the room. I did not rush my steps or look at the floor. I projected absolute terrifying authority with every deliberate stride across the expensive carpet. My posture was perfectly straight, radiating the quiet, immense power of a man who held their entire fabricated universe firmly in his hands. The air in the massive room grew incredibly dense as I marched directly toward my terrified son. Brandon completely lost his voice mid-sentence. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. All the fake, arrogant color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a completely terrified, deeply trapped animal. He frantically raised his right hand and aggressively signaled the hired private security detail stationed near the stage. He desperately mouthed strict orders for them to intercept my path and physically throw me out of the building immediately. 4 large men in dark suits stepped forward from the perimeter, forming a thick human wall between myself and the elevated stage. They anticipated dealing with a confused, weak old man who had wandered into the wrong high society event. They completely miscalculated the severe situation. I did not break my steady, measured stride. I locked my eyes directly onto the lead guard and continued walking forward with absolute chilling conviction. I possessed an undeniable aura of raw, legitimate command that instantly halted the aggressive security contractors dead in their tracks. My unyielding, icy demeanor silently communicated that touching my physical person would explicitly result in their immediate total professional ruin. The guards instinctively parted, stepping aside to create a clear, unobstructed path directly to the podium. Brandon stood silently and watched his heavily paid defensive line completely dissolve into thin air. He stood completely frozen, paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable reality of his impending public destruction. I smoothly bypassed the bewildered security team and climbed the 3 small steps up to the main stage. I stopped inches away from Brandon, forcing him to step back from the microphone in absolute disgrace. The entire ballroom sat in stunned, breathless silence, completely captivated by the sudden, highly intense confrontation occurring under the bright spotlights. I very calmly reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I slowly pulled out a thick, impeccably organized stack of highly verified, officially stamped legal documents. I gently tapped the heavy papers against the mahogany podium, preparing to completely dismantle his fragile empire word by word. I leaned into the microphone and projected my voice clearly across the dead silent room. Before hundreds of elite business owners, wealthy local politicians, and prominent financial figures, I formally introduced myself as the silent sole owner of Wright Holdings, LLC. A collective massive gasp immediately rippled through the lavish crowd. The investors sitting at the front tables instantly recognized the massive corporate entity that controlled half the city. I did not pause to let the shocking revelation settle. I raised the stark white eviction notice high into the air and read the devastating legal termination of Brandon's dealership lease entirely out loud. I detailed his massive business defaults, severe moral turpitude, and the catastrophic loss of his international franchise agreements. I placed the red-stained platinum credit card statements directly under the podium camera, projecting the severe digital images onto the massive screens behind me. I exposed Megan's malicious $50,000 identity theft to her entire circle of superficial friends. I showed the precise transaction logs detailing her vulgar luxury shopping spree fueled purely by stolen cash. For the final, absolutely fatal blow, I displayed the irrefutable time-stamped pawnshop receipts proving she had heartlessly sold my late wife's priceless antique family pearls for quick, untraceable street money. The absolute entirety of their completely fabricated illusion of wealth and moral superiority evaporated in mere seconds. The room realized that the glamorous couple standing before them were nothing more than broke, desperate felons actively drowning in catastrophic debt and facing immediate federal prosecution. Their curated high society masks were violently ripped away, leaving them completely naked and utterly humiliated. Brandon slumped against the back wall, violently hyperventilating while his destroyed social kingdom burned to ashes around him. The massive, beautifully decorated grand ballroom instantly erupted into a wave of chaotic, incredibly panicked whispers. The wealthy investors and influential politicians abruptly stood up from their velvet chairs, completely desperate to permanently distance themselves from the incredibly toxic, imploding couple. They rapidly abandoned their half-eaten, expensive gourmet meals and quickly began walking out the heavy oak doors in massive, frantic droves. Brandon's entire professional network evaporated directly in front of his face, actively severing all remaining ties to his doomed existence. Megan watched the absolute destruction of her coveted social standing and completely lost her fragile mind. The sheer magnitude of her instant public exile triggered an absolutely violent, unhinged reaction. She shrieked like a wild, cornered animal and violently smashed her expensive crystal wine glass directly against the edge of the VIP table. Gripping the jagged, razor-sharp stem tightly in her manicured hand, she wildly lunged directly toward the wooden podium, fully intending to slash my face. I did not flinch or attempt to move away from her chaotic attack. Before she could close the small gap between us, 2 towering men wearing sharp, unassuming business suits swiftly stepped forward from the dispersing crowd. The highly trained plainclothes federal officers intercepted her violent trajectory instantly. They aggressively grabbed her thrashing wrists tightly, twisting her arms painfully behind her back, and quickly forced her face down onto the cold marble floor. The distant, unmistakable wail of approaching police sirens began echoing loudly down the dark, cold city streets outside, perfectly signaling the absolute final conclusion of their horrific reign. The swift, brutal motion of the federal officers brought Megan crashing down hard onto the polished marble floor. her expensive designer gown snagged against the sharp edge of a fallen chair as the plainclothes agents forcefully twisted her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs clamping tightly around her delicate wrists echoed sharply throughout the massive, deadly silent ballroom. The remaining wealthy guests who had previously applauded her fabricated speech of victimhood now stood completely frozen in absolute horror at the shocking spectacle. The lead federal agent pulled her upright and loudly began reading her Miranda rights, his booming voice cutting through the ambient classical music still playing from the ceiling speakers. He explicitly cited the formal charges of massive federal identity theft, severe wire fraud, and premeditated grand larceny. Megan violently thrashed against his iron grip, her meticulously styled hair falling across her tear-stained face in absolute disarray. She aggressively twisted her neck and screamed hysterically toward the front stage, demanding that her husband immediately utilize his power and wealth to stop the severe public humiliation. She begged him to call their expensive lawyers and fix the catastrophic situation. Brandon did not move a single muscle to help his wife. He stood completely paralyzed behind the heavy mahogany podium, his knuckles entirely white, as he gripped the wooden edges for sheer physical support. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring blankly at the federal agents dragging his screaming wife through the grand oak doors. He was entirely broken, fundamentally unable to process the total destruction of his curated reality. I stood quietly near the entrance, watching the brutal extraction unfold with absolute emotional detachment. The loud wailing city police sirens outside completely drowned out her final, incredibly pathetic screams for pure, unearned mercy today. Monday morning arrived with the brutal, completely unforgiving efficiency of a massive corporate demolition. The crisp, early sunlight illuminated a devastating scene outside Brandon's once pristine luxury car dealership. An entire fleet of heavy transport trucks and massive flatbed haulers completely surrounded the vast perimeter of the commercial lot. A coordinated squad of stern federal marshals marched past the towering glass windows holding thick clipboards and formal seizure warrants. The disastrous, highly illegal loan Brandon had so arrogantly secured from the unregulated underworld syndicate had instantly triggered an inescapable chain reaction. The moment the fraudulent deed was flagged in the Central Municipal Registry, the severe red alert automatically notified his primary corporate creditors. The massive international banking institutions managing his floor plan financing executed a swift, unyielding default clause across every single one of his legitimate business accounts. The banks demanded immediate full repayment of millions of dollars in outstanding inventory loans, effectively seizing his physical assets to offset their massive financial exposure. Brandon stood helplessly on the cold concrete sidewalk, completely barred from entering his own glass office by two towering federal agents. He watched in absolute silent horror as thick steel chains were securely wrapped around the axles of his remaining high-end imported vehicles. The powerful winches whined loudly, dragging the gleaming sports cars and luxury sedans directly up the rusted metal ramps of the waiting flatbeds. The highly paid salesmen and mechanics who previously catered to his every arrogant whim now stood quietly on the periphery, holding cardboard boxes filled with their personal belongings, watching the fake empire violently crumble to dust. The operation was executed with a cold, terrifying precision that left absolutely zero room for negotiation or desperate pleading. Within 3 short hours, the massive asphalt lot was completely stripped bare, leaving nothing behind but dark tire marks and the hollow shell of a highly successful business. Brandon stood shivering in the sharp morning wind, totally stripped of his wealth, his highly curated public status, and his professional future. The incredibly thorough, sweeping devastation surrounding his life was perfectly absolute and completely irreversible today. Brandon stood completely alone in the center of the vast, entirely empty asphalt lot. The deafening silence of the abandoned dealership pressed heavily against his ringing ears. His hands shook violently as he looked down at the thick stack of official foreclosure documents the federal marshals had forcefully shoved into his chest before driving away. He flipped past the standard banking seizure notices and the terrifying federal fraud indictments stemming from the illegal loan shark transaction. He stared directly at the final, heavily stamped commercial eviction order that had officially initiated the catastrophic sequence of events. His bloodshot eyes scanned the dense corporate text until they locked onto the bold, embossed letterhead positioned at the very top of the pristine page. He read the name Wright Holdings, LLC over and over again, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the invisible force that had so easily crushed his reality. He examined the complex corporate hierarchy outlined in the attached legal addendum. He traced the primary executive signatures, suddenly recognizing the incredibly precise, deeply familiar handwriting anchoring the entire multi-million-dollar holding company. The final, absolute realization struck him with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. He finally connected the dots, completely understanding the massive lethal mechanism behind his sudden ruin. The incredibly ruthless, brilliant corporate landlord who had flawlessly orchestrated the total annihilation of his entire business empire was the exact same quiet, unassuming father he had arrogantly called a useless parasite just days prior. The profound terror of his colossal miscalculation paralyzed his lungs, leaving him gasping for air in the empty parking lot. He had maliciously and foolishly attempted to destroy a sleeping giant, and the angry giant had effortlessly erased his entire existence forever. Driven by sheer, unadulterated panic, Brandon frantically pulled his smartphone from his tailored jacket pocket. His hands trembled so violently that he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the cold asphalt. He urgently dialed my private residential number, praying for a sudden miracle. I sat quietly in my study, staring at the ringing phone, and finally answered the call. Brandon immediately broke down, sobbing uncontrollably into the tiny receiver. His arrogant facade was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, weeping voice of a totally broken man. He desperately begged for my financial mercy, pleading with me to halt the aggressive federal actions and restore his shattered life. He aggressively attempted to deflect the entire mountain of blame, screaming hysterically that Megan had completely manipulated his fragile mind into executing the horrific plot against me. He insisted that the illegal conservatorship, the fake doctor, and the massive forgery were entirely her malicious ideas, casting himself as an innocent victim of her unhinged greed. I listened to his frantic, cowardly excuses without showing a single shred of emotional reaction. I did not raise my voice or offer any lengthy justification for my precise retaliatory actions. I calmly informed my son that cowardice does not ever absolve incredible cruelty, and his fundamental lack of basic morality had permanently sealed his absolute destruction. I explicitly told him that our relationship was entirely finished, and he would face the brutal federal consequences of his actions completely alone. I pressed the small red button, ending the call permanently, and comfortably returned to reading my book. The massive, heavy steel doors of the federal detention center slammed shut behind Megan, but her stay was agonizingly brief. Brandon, completely stripped of his corporate capital and locked out of his frozen bank accounts, resorted to desperate, humiliating measures to secure her release. He frantically gathered his extensive collection of imported designer watches, custom-tailored Italian suits, and diamond cufflinks. He dragged the heavy velvet garment bags down to the same gritty, neon-lit pawn districts he once mocked. He liquidated his entire personal wardrobe for pennies on the dollar, barely scraping together enough untraceable cash to satisfy the exorbitant bail bondsman. Megan walked out of the holding facility wearing the same wrinkled designer gown she was arrested in. Brandon drove her back to their sprawling luxury mansion in a rented economy vehicle, a stark downgrade from his seized luxury fleet. They entered a dark, completely unfurnished house. The federal marshals had aggressively stripped the property of every valuable asset, leaving behind nothing but bare walls and deeply scuffed hardwood floors. Instead of expressing a single ounce of gratitude to the husband who had just pawned his last remaining possessions to buy her temporary freedom, Megan erupted into a vicious, unhinged rage. She stood in the center of the empty living room and shrieked at the top of her lungs. She violently blamed Brandon for her devastating public humiliation and their rapid descent into absolute poverty. She screamed that his incompetence and pathetic inability to control his own father had single-handedly destroyed her perfect life. She ruthlessly mocked his tears and firmly declared that she would absolutely not serve a federal prison sentence for his massive financial failures. The fractured alliance between the two greedy criminals violently shattered in the cold, dark night forever. Operating purely on ruthless self-preservation, Megan quickly decided to entirely betray the man who had just bankrupted himself to save her. She quietly slipped out of the echoing mansion the very next morning, walking several miles to a dilapidated strip mall on the absolute outskirts of the wealthy suburban city. She walked into a dusty convenience store and purchased a cheap, completely untraceable prepaid burner phone using a crumpled $20 bill she had secretly hidden inside her designer shoe. Sitting alone on a cracked wooden bench in a deserted park, she manually dialed my secure private number. When I calmly answered the completely unexpected call, she completely dropped her previous aggressive, deeply entitled persona. She desperately utilized a soft, incredibly vulnerable tone, explicitly attempting to manipulate my paternal instincts. She offered a highly treacherous, entirely selfish legal deal directly to me. She enthusiastically promised to officially testify against Brandon in federal court, eagerly offering to provide completely devastating, heavily fabricated witness testimony. She coldly stated that she would formally swear under oath that Brandon had physically and aggressively forced her to violently steal my personal identity and maliciously forge the massive commercial mortgage. She explicitly painted herself as a terrified, heavily abused wife who merely followed her psychotic husband's ruthless criminal orders out of sheer physical terror. She meticulously outlined her twisted strategy, confidently assuring me that her flawless performance on the witness stand would undoubtedly guarantee his permanent incarceration behind heavily reinforced steel bars. She callously offered to personally deliver his absolute destruction on a silver platter, entirely eliminating the need for a lengthy, drawn-out federal trial. Her absolute betrayal was breathtakingly precise and completely devoid of any basic human loyalty. However, her sudden legal cooperation carried a massive, highly specific financial price tag. She explicitly demanded a direct, entirely untraceable cash payment of exactly $100,000 immediately deposited into a secure offshore banking account. Furthermore, she aggressively insisted that I directly utilize my vast corporate legal influence to officially dismiss every single major federal criminal charge currently pending against her person immediately without any further delay. I calmly agreed to physically meet her that very afternoon in a busy, heavily populated public park located downtown. Before leaving my secure study, I meticulously pinned a highly sensitive military-grade hidden recording device directly underneath my dark cashmere lapel. The microscopic digital microphone was entirely invisible to the naked eye. I arrived exactly on time and sat down on a cold iron bench beside the decorative fountain. Megan arrived shortly after, looking anxiously over her shoulder, completely unaware that she was walking directly into another flawlessly executed trap. She sat closely beside me and immediately began to enthusiastically reiterate her highly treacherous, completely fabricated narrative. She eagerly detailed her vicious betrayal against her husband, enthusiastically supplying me with incredibly damning, deeply personal information about Brandon's severe financial desperation and complete psychological breakdown. She mercilessly threw the man who had just pawned his entire life to secure her absolute freedom directly under the proverbial bus without a single trace of genuine remorse. I sat completely still, maintaining unbroken stony eye contact, as the highly advanced digital device silently captured every single treacherous, unforgivable word in pristine high-definition audio. She smiled arrogantly, fully expecting me to enthusiastically accept her devious proposition to permanently eliminate my troublesome son from the complicated equation entirely. Once she completely finished detailing her extremely elaborate, incredibly selfish betrayal, I slowly stood up from the cold iron bench. I looked down at her hopeful, greedy face and firmly stated that I absolutely do not negotiate with verified, unhinged federal criminals under any circumstances whatsoever. I flatly refused her disgusting, pathetic deal without offering any further explanation. I slowly turned my broad back on her utterly bewildered facial expression and calmly walked away across the freshly cut green grass, leaving her completely alone today forever. I returned to the absolute quiet sanctuary of my personal study and immediately connected the hidden recording device directly to my secure desktop computer. I meticulously extracted the pristine, unedited digital audio file, verifying that every single treacherous syllable Megan had spoken was crystal clear. I quickly drafted a new, entirely blank email addressed directly to Brandon's primary personal account. I securely attached the incredibly damaging audio file and carefully typed a very brief, highly specific subject line reading, "Your special wife." I firmly pressed send, instantly launching the fatal digital torpedo directly into his shattered, pathetic life. Miles away, Brandon sat completely alone at a small, deeply scratched wooden folding table positioned in the dead center of his vast, empty luxury living room. The power company had officially disconnected his electrical service hours ago due to massive non-payment, leaving him sitting in the total unforgiving dark. He was miserably eating a cheap, entirely cold, canned dinner, illuminated only by the harsh, weak glow of his cracked smartphone screen. He watched his digital inbox refresh, instantly noticing the incoming message bearing my familiar address. Driven by a morbid, desperate curiosity, he slowly tapped the attached audio file and pressed play. Megan's incredibly clear, venomous voice immediately filled the dark, empty mansion. Brandon sat completely paralyzed in the crushing darkness, listening in sheer, unadulterated horror as the wife he had just sacrificed his entire existence to physically rescue casually offered to completely destroy his life for a stack of untraceable cash today. Brandon listened to the final treacherous syllable of his wife's pristine audio recording echoing through the dark, unfurnished living room. A blinding, immensely white-hot rage completely consumed his fractured mind. He violently hurled his cracked smartphone directly across the vast space. The heavy device slammed aggressively into an antique gold-framed mirror resting against the bare wall. The expensive glass instantly shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, cascading onto the scuffed hardwood floor with a deafening crash. The violent noise immediately summoned Megan from the upper master bedroom. She viciously stomped down the grand, sweeping staircase, demanding an explanation for the sudden chaos disrupting her miserable evening. Brandon did not offer a single word of greeting. He immediately lunged forward and retrieved the damaged phone from the debris. He forcefully swiped the cracked screen, cranking the volume to the absolute maximum limit, and hit play again. Megan froze completely on the bottom step. Her own crystal-clear voice bounced off the bare walls, proudly offering to completely destroy her husband for $100,000 and full federal immunity. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. Brandon stepped aggressively toward her, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. He demanded to know how she could ruthlessly betray the man who had just pawned his entire existence to buy her temporary freedom. Megan instantly abandoned her momentary shock and violently doubled down. She aggressively closed the distance between them, screaming hysterically that her survival was the only thing that mattered. The sprawling, empty luxury mansion instantly erupted into a vicious, totally unhinged screaming match. The two greedy villains viciously tore each other apart in the desolate ruins of their completely shattered kingdom. They traded incredibly vicious personal insults and extremely hard physical shoves, entirely destroying the very last remaining fragments of their highly toxic, deeply fraudulent marriage completely tonight. The brutal physical altercation completely shattered their remaining pretense of civility. Brandon stormed aggressively up the grand, sweeping staircase, leaving Megan sobbing angrily in the dark foyer. He violently kicked open her massive walk-in closet doors and mercilessly grabbed her remaining imported designer luggage. Without folding a single item of clothing or showing any ounce of basic care, he ruthlessly shoved her expensive silk dresses, heavily beaded gowns, and premium leather handbags directly into the oversized suitcases. He practically ripped the zippers shut and dragged the incredibly heavy bags violently down the wooden steps, allowing them to bounce and crash against the delicate banister. Brandon aggressively hauled the heavy luggage directly through the grand double doors and ruthlessly hurled the expensive bags entirely off the marble porch. The massive suitcases slammed heavily onto the wet, severely cracked concrete driveway just as a freezing, torrential rainstorm violently unleashed its fury upon the darkened estate. The brutal impact completely popped the fragile zippers, violently spilling Megan's prized luxury garments directly into the deep, muddy puddles forming rapidly on the cold ground. Megan sprinted aggressively out the front doors into the freezing downpour, entirely unhinged by the absolute destruction of her final material possessions. She stood trembling in the freezing rain, wildly waving her manicured arms and viciously screaming incredibly vile, completely unforgivable obscenities directly at Brandon. She hysterically declared that he was a fundamentally worthless, utterly pathetic failure who had single-handedly ruined her incredibly perfect life with his breathtaking, undeniable incompetence. Across the dark street, several wealthy, highly judgmental neighbors slowly pushed aside their heavy velvet curtains. They held their glowing smartphones directly against the cold glass of their master bedroom windows, silently recording the chaotic, incredibly pathetic public downfall of the previously arrogant couple. Brandon completely ignored her endless, agonizing screaming and violently slammed the heavy front doors permanently shut. He perfectly locked out the highly toxic monster he had once so foolishly loved, finally ending their wretched, deeply parasitic partnership forever in the freezing dark night without any remorse. A cheap yellow cab splashed aggressively through the deep puddles, completely bypassing the massive wrought iron gates. Megan violently shoved her ruined luggage into the rusted trunk and angrily sped away into the stormy night, permanently abandoning her shattered, luxurious illusion. The flickering taillights had barely faded into the heavy rain when a sleek official municipal vehicle silently pulled directly onto the property. A stern, impeccably dressed bank representative stepped cautiously out of the dark sedan, tightly clutching a thick, waterproof briefcase to his chest. He briskly marched up the slippery marble steps and knocked aggressively on the heavy front doors. Brandon slowly pulled the thick wood open, his exhausted face completely devoid of any remaining arrogant pride. The professional representative did not waste a single second offering any hollow corporate apologies. He firmly handed Brandon a severely worded, officially stamped final foreclosure notice. The dense legal text boldly outlined the absolute financial reality of his grim situation. Without the massive, previously reliable monthly payments streaming directly from his mother's highly secure corporate trust fund, the underlying luxury mortgage had completely and violently defaulted. The holding bank officially reclaimed total legal ownership of the sprawling residential estate, effective immediately. Brandon stared blankly at the severe eviction terms printed clearly in bold red ink. The representative explicitly stated that all utility services were officially terminated, and Brandon possessed exactly 72 hours to completely vacate the physical premises before heavily armed federal marshals returned to forcefully extract him. The bank agent sharply turned on his polished heels and swiftly marched back to his warm vehicle completely, leaving Brandon standing entirely alone in the incredibly freezing, entirely unforgiving, completely dark, incredibly empty, utterly devastated doorway tonight without any remaining hope. Brandon slowly closed the heavy front doors, completely retreating back into the pitch-black, entirely unfurnished mansion. He was absolutely destitute, entirely friendless, and completely severed from any legitimate social connections. The terrifying, crushing reality of his imminent criminal indictment for the massive forged commercial mortgage weighed incredibly heavily upon his fractured, terrified mind. Without any remaining funds or valuable physical assets to trade for basic legal protection, his impending federal prosecution was an absolute, undeniable certainty. He mechanically walked upstairs to his massive master bedroom and pulled a single cheap canvas duffel bag from the dusty closet shelf. He did not pack his remaining tailored suits or expensive designer shoes. He simply gathered a few basic changes of clothing, completely abandoning the artificial, highly curated identity he had maliciously weaponized against his own father. The fake luxury empire he had arrogantly stolen was completely annihilated, leaving him with absolutely nothing but severe, inescapable federal debt. Brandon zipped the small canvas bag tightly shut and heavily descended the grand staircase for the absolute final time. He walked directly out the front doors, completely surrendering the sprawling foreclosed property back to the ruthless corporate bankers. The freezing, torrential downpour immediately soaked through his thin jacket, severely chilling his body as he stepped onto the dark street. He did not ever call a local taxi or frantically search for a non-existent sympathetic friend tonight. Brandon gripped the wet canvas strap tightly and slowly began walking through the incredibly aggressive, punishing rainstorm toward the single, incredibly humbling, totally unforgiving final location remaining in the world. Brandon dragged his heavy, completely soaked canvas duffel bag up the familiar wooden steps of my secure front porch. The freezing, torrential downpour had entirely saturated his thin jacket, plastering his expensive clothes directly against his shivering skin. He stood under the harsh amber glow of the security light, looking absolutely pathetic, entirely stripped of the arrogant corporate armor he had worn just a few days ago. He raised his trembling fist and pounded desperately against the heavy oak door. I watched him on the high-definition security feed for several long moments before slowly turning the deadbolt and pulling the door open. The very second the warm light spilled out onto the wet floorboards, Brandon dramatically collapsed directly onto his bruised knees. He looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes and immediately launched into a masterful, tear-soaked monologue he had clearly rehearsed during his agonizing walk. He violently sobbed, loudly proclaiming that losing his entire fake empire was the brutal awakening he desperately needed to finally see the light. He aggressively begged for my paternal forgiveness, weaving a highly manipulative tale about finding ultimate personal redemption in his darkest, most painful hour. He hysterically claimed that Megan's incredibly toxic influence had completely poisoned his mind, blinding him to the profound, unconditional love I had supposedly always offered. He swore on his life that he was ready to become the honorable, respectful son I had always deserved. He clutched the wet fabric of his bag and pleaded for just one single night of warmth, promising to rebuild our completely shattered relationship from the ground up tomorrow. His performance was incredibly theatrical, carefully filled with flawless emotional inflections, deliberately designed to completely break any normal, highly unsuspecting parent's fundamentally vulnerable, loving heart. I looked down at the miserable, dripping figure kneeling on my welcome mat, without feeling a single solitary ounce of paternal pity. The heavy rain continued to aggressively lash against his violently shaking shoulders, but I absolutely did not step aside to offer him any immediate sanctuary. I stared directly into his panicked, calculating eyes and coldly informed him that genuine forgiveness strictly requires absolute, undeniable, completely transparent personal accountability. I slowly reached inside my warm, tailored blazer and pulled out a crisp, perfectly dry legal document meticulously crafted earlier that exact afternoon by my elite attorney, Jonathan Pierce. I held the severe, highly binding contract firmly in my right hand, strategically keeping it safely out of the violent, howling wind. I calmly explained that the densely typed pages contained a full, legally sound confession explicitly detailing every single one of his horrific, deeply parasitic crimes. The pristine document flawlessly outlined his aggressive, sustained elder abuse, the malicious, premeditated forgery of my original commercial property deed, and his active, undeniable conspiracy to commit massive federal fraud against my highly secure estate. I clearly stated that the flawless contract officially stripped him of all remaining legal defenses, permanently ensuring his impending upcoming federal prosecution would seamlessly proceed rapidly without any complicated, incredibly drawn-out courtroom battles. I silently looked at my violently shivering, utterly defeated son, and aggressively presented my absolute, totally non-negotiable, incredibly severe final ultimatum for the evening. He absolutely had to physically sign his complete legal name directly onto the heavily binding confession right here on the freezing concrete porch before I would ever seriously consider allowing him to cross the physical threshold into my warm, heavily secure home today. I explicitly clarified that placing his fraudulent, worthless signature directly on the solid dotted line was the absolute only acceptable currency currently remaining to purchase a few temporary hours of basic physical comfort. I held out a heavy black ink pen, confidently offering him a brutal, completely unyielding choice between enduring the devastating freezing storm outside or willingly signing his entire remaining freedom away to officially secure his incredibly temporary, entirely pathetic, immediate survival tonight. Brandon stared blankly at the impeccably typed legal document, his trembling hands violently shaking as he slowly processed the absolutely devastating gravity of my severe demand. His panicked, exhausted mind frantically raced, fully realizing that placing his signature on that crisp white paper formally guaranteed a lengthy, entirely inescapable federal prison sentence. He clearly understood that he was essentially locking his own heavy iron cell door and handing the polished steel key directly to his executioner. For a brief, agonizing moment, he desperately considered rejecting the fatal contract, turning his back on my warm house, and walking away into the freezing darkness to fight the severe charges on his own terms. However, the punishing torrential rain violently lashed against his shivering spine, rapidly draining the very last remaining drops of his physical heat and deeply fractured resolve. His sheer, unadulterated desperation entirely consumed his previously arrogant, incredibly foolish, and deeply misplaced pride today. The incredibly dark, completely unforgiving reality of his absolute, inescapable poverty violently forced his reluctant, heavily trembling hand tonight. With water aggressively streaming down his pale, bruised face, Brandon slowly reached forward and accepted the heavy black pen from my firm grip. He pressed the sharp ink tip directly against the solid dotted line, meticulously scrawling his full legal name onto the binding, highly severe corporate confession. He officially signed his entire remaining freedom away, trading his entire future for the incredibly pathetic, remarkably brief comfort of a dry, warm room. He handed the fatally damning document back to me, his shoulders completely slumped in ultimate total defeat. I swiftly secured the pristine paper safely inside my warm, tailored blazer, meticulously verifying the wet signature before finally stepping backward to grant him temporary physical access into the illuminated, deeply silent entryway. The heavy oak door finally shut firmly, sealing us inside the completely silent, perfectly insulated foyer. The exact moment the black ink officially dried on that damning federal confession, Brandon's entire pathetic physical demeanor violently and instantly shifted. The weeping, entirely broken victim routine immediately vanished, violently replaced by the absolutely terrifying, highly unpredictable aggression of a desperate, totally cornered animal. He abruptly dropped his soaked canvas duffel bag onto the hardwood floor and aggressively reached deep into his wet jacket pocket. He violently pulled out a sharp, incredibly lethal tactical folding knife, swiftly flicking his wrist to snap the heavy steel blade perfectly open. He lunged forward with completely unhinged speed, aggressively pointing the gleaming, razor-sharp metal tip directly at my exposed throat. His chest heaved violently as he completely abandoned his highly fabricated apology, immediately replacing his fake tears with a manic, incredibly dangerous snarl. He viciously demanded that I immediately log onto my secure desktop computer and physically transfer the absolute entirety of my massive corporate holding accounts directly into his hidden offshore ledger. He wildly screamed that he absolutely refused to rot inside a tiny federal prison cell, explicitly threatening to completely end my life right here in the hallway if I dared to refuse his final violent demand. He pressed the cold steel blade closer to my skin, his eyes wide and completely devoid of any remaining human sanity. He genuinely believed that pure, unadulterated physical violence could miraculously reverse his total destruction entirely, underestimating my meticulously prepared countermeasure today. I stared directly down the razor-sharp edge of the tactical blade pressing against my throat. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not step back. Decades spent engineering load-bearing commercial structures and massive suspension bridges had taught me one absolute undeniable truth about physical reality. A foundation built on fundamentally corrupt, unstable materials will always inevitably culminate in a violently catastrophic collapse. I had fully anticipated this exact pathetic physical reaction the very moment I saw the profound desperation pooling in his bloodshot eyes. Brandon possessed absolutely zero moral fortitude, making his ultimate descent into raw violence completely predictable. He was a fundamentally flawed structural beam finally buckling under the sheer unyielding weight of total accountability. He practically screamed his delusional demands into my face, spraying cold rainwater across the pristine foyer, desperately expecting my absolute terror. Instead of begging for my life or attempting to negotiate with a cornered animal, I maintained a steady, entirely detached gaze. I slowly lowered my left hand, allowing it to casually brush against the polished mahogany edge of the hallway console table directly beside me. I did not make any sudden or aggressive movements that would trigger his trembling trigger finger. I seamlessly reached beneath the thick wooden lip and firmly pressed the heavily concealed biometric panic button, securely mounted out of sight. The silent alarm instantly transmitted a highly encrypted absolute priority distress signal directly to the elite tactical units completely surrounding the perimeter of my property. I had explicitly instructed Jonathan Pierce to position heavily armed law enforcement teams in the deep shadows of my estate hours before Brandon even arrived. I knew the confession would officially break his fragile, arrogant mind. I simply stood my ground in the cold draft of the doorway, waiting patiently for the imminent forceful neutralization of my son. The immediate, overwhelming physical response was spectacularly violent and flawlessly synchronized. A split second after my finger engaged the silent distress trigger, the incredibly heavy, reinforced oak double doors at the front entrance violently burst completely open with a massive, deafening crash. Simultaneously, the heavy steel security door positioned at the back of the long corridor aggressively shattered inward, completely eliminating any conceivable avenue of physical retreat. A highly specialized, heavily armed tactical police unit meticulously positioned strategically in the freezing rain hours prior by Jonathan's explicit, incredibly thorough legal arrangement aggressively swarmed the narrow residential hallway. The dark, heavily armored figures moved with incredibly terrifying mechanical precision, completely flooding the illuminated foyer in a matter of milliseconds. Brandon did not even possess the basic cognitive processing speed to fully register the massive, organized federal ambush violently collapsing upon him. He wildly whipped his head toward the deafening noise, momentarily pulling the sharp tactical blade safely away from my exposed neck. That single microscopic lapse in his panicked concentration was completely and utterly fatal. 3 massive tactical officers violently launched their entire physical body weight directly forward, aggressively tackling Brandon straight onto the polished hardwood floor with a bone-crushing thud. The incredibly sudden, massive kinetic impact instantly knocked all the wind completely out of his burning lungs. A heavily armored combat boot brutally stomped down directly onto his right wrist, violently pinning his dominant arm against the rigid floorboards. The sharp, incredibly lethal folding knife was forcefully kicked far away from his trembling, entirely useless fingers, skittering uselessly into the dark corner of the spacious hallway. Brandon violently thrashed against the overwhelming, sheer physical force bearing down upon his crushed spine, screaming wildly in pure, unadulterated terror as his entire universe officially ended. The officers aggressively drove their heavy knees directly into his soaked, shivering back, flawlessly executing the absolute, completely unyielding physical neutralization of a highly dangerous, totally unhinged domestic threat. The pristine, flawlessly constructed trap had snapped permanently shut, entirely destroying the pathetic monster currently bleeding directly on my floor today. The heavily armored officers brutally twisted Brandon's bruised arms entirely behind his back, clamping incredibly thick, cold steel handcuffs tightly around his throbbing wrists. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound echoed definitively throughout the utterly destroyed, chaotic entryway. Brandon wildly thrashed his completely soaked, shivering head against the unforgiving hardwood floor, hysterically screaming absolute bloody murder directly into the brightly lit foyer. He viciously cursed my name with pure, unadulterated hatred, aggressively screaming that I was an incredibly heartless, completely unnatural monster who had maliciously, deliberately set him up to physically die in federal prison. He shrieked that I had systematically engineered his entire total destruction from the very beginning, furiously refusing to accept a single solitary ounce of responsibility for his massive, terrifyingly foolish, entirely catastrophic mistakes. I completely ignored his violent, pathetic temper tantrum, calmly reaching down to retrieve the pristine, perfectly dry, signed legal confession resting gently on the wooden floorboards. I slowly stood perfectly upright, meticulously brushing a few stray drops of freezing rainwater entirely off my immaculate tailored lapel. I looked down at the violently weeping, entirely defeated creature bleeding slowly onto my polished floor. I spoke in a quiet, incredibly steady, completely unwavering voice that smoothly pierced directly through his hysterical, manic shrieking. I explicitly told my pathetic son that an incredibly clear, perfectly polished glass mirror only ever passively reflects the exact profound ugliness directly placed before its fragile surface. I calmly clarified that I had absolutely never created the vile, unhinged monster currently screaming aggressively on my floor today. I simply provided the necessary, beautifully engineered structural mirror required to finally force him to perfectly see his own dark, horrific reflection completely clearly tonight without any remaining comfortable illusions. Brandon was violently dragged from my pristine residential property and officially transported directly into the cold, incredibly harsh reality of the federal justice system. He was aggressively processed, thoroughly searched, and securely locked deep inside a maximum security holding cell, completely surrounded by thick, impenetrable concrete walls. His damp, incredibly cheap canvas clothing clung tightly to his shivering spine as he sat entirely alone on a rigid steel bench, waiting helplessly in total darkness. Hours slowly bled away until the crisp, early morning sun finally began to rise over the sprawling, utterly indifferent city skyline. The brilliant golden rays illuminated the towering glass windows of the grand civil courthouse, officially marking the heavily scheduled arrival of the highly anticipated, deeply fraudulent conservatorship hearing today. The massive, entirely fabricated legal battle that Brandon had so maliciously and arrogantly initiated against my personal autonomy would indeed proceed entirely as planned this morning. However, the fundamental dynamics of the aggressive courtroom confrontation had violently and permanently shifted overnight. The incredibly arrogant, deeply entitled plaintiff who had viciously demanded total control over my massive corporate estate was no longer a wealthy, invincible dealership owner confidently walking through the polished wooden doors. Instead, the deeply broken, utterly ruined creature, formerly known as my son, was now forcefully arriving completely shackled in heavy iron chains, formally branded as an unhinged, incredibly dangerous federal felon, completely facing absolute, total, and completely irreversible financial and personal annihilation. His ultimate, flawless execution was absolutely and perfectly orchestrated by the very man he had so violently attempted to completely crush and entirely consume forever. The heavy mahogany doors of the municipal courthouse swung open, revealing a gallery packed tightly with local media reporters and prominent business owners. They murmured in hushed, eager tones, anticipating the spectacular downfall of the once arrogant dealership tycoon. Brandon was forcefully marched down the center aisle by two heavily armed bailiffs. The deafening rattle of his heavy iron chains echoed sharply against the high, vaulted ceiling, announcing his deeply humiliating arrival. He was unceremoniously shoved into the wooden chair at the plaintiff's table, wearing a glaringly bright orange prison jumpsuit that completely erased his former corporate identity. He sat entirely alone. The expensive, high-powered civil attorneys he had previously retained to completely dismantle my personal autonomy stood stiffly at the adjacent podium. The lead counsel immediately addressed the presiding judge, loudly speaking directly into the official court microphone for the permanent record. He formally and aggressively filed a mandatory motion to withdraw entirely from the incredibly toxic case. He explicitly cited a total, undeniable lack of financial payment, bluntly revealing that Brandon's retainer checks had completely bounced following the massive federal asset seizure. The attorney did not stop there. He ruthlessly added that his prestigious firm had been actively deceived by severe, fraudulent pretenses, entirely refusing to represent a client currently facing a mountain of massive federal criminal indictments. Brandon stared blankly at his former legal advocates, his shackled hands trembling violently against the scarred wooden table. The judge swiftly granted the immediate withdrawal without a single second of hesitation, leaving Brandon to face the catastrophic consequences of his malicious conservatorship petition completely undefended and entirely exposed. The very trap he had so meticulously engineered to steal my estate had now flawlessly locked him inside a public, incredibly brutal, completely inescapable cage of his own making here today. To desperately secure a highly favorable plea agreement and significantly reduce her own impending federal prison sentence, Megan deliberately took the witness stand directly against her former partner in crime. She proudly raised her right hand and formally swore under absolute penalty of perjury, fully prepared to completely annihilate Brandon's incredibly fragile remaining defenses. She flawlessly executed her calculated, highly treacherous narrative, explicitly pointing a manicured finger directly at the shackled man, trembling violently at the plaintiff's table. She confidently testified that Brandon had maliciously engineered the entire massive criminal plot to forcefully declare my person entirely insane and ruthlessly steal the highly lucrative commercial real estate portfolio. She eagerly described his terrifying sociopathic obsession with my corporate assets, explicitly painting him as the sole, highly manipulative mastermind behind the incredibly illegal medical forgery and the incredibly devastating commercial conservatorship petition. She dramatically wept completely fake, perfectly timed tears, aggressively claiming that she was merely a completely terrified, severely abused hostage who was violently forced to blindly follow his terrifying, unhinged criminal directives out of sheer physical terror. She effortlessly supplied the court with incredibly damning, highly specific dates and precise geographical locations where Brandon had secretly met with the heavily compromised underground document forgers to execute his massive financial fraud. The presiding judge sat completely motionless behind the elevated wooden bench, listening to the deeply pathetic, entirely fabricated testimony with utter, unfiltered disgust. He sharply observed the two greedy villains violently tearing each other apart in the extremely public, heavily documented judicial forum. Brandon violently rattled his heavy iron chains in pure, unadulterated fury, wildly screaming that she was a filthy, incredibly toxic liar who had originally hatched the entire catastrophic scheme. The armed bailiffs aggressively forced him violently back into his wooden chair, silencing his hysterical, totally unhinged outburst completely. Megan did not flinch or offer any apology. She simply maintained her perfectly rehearsed, incredibly cold composure, eagerly watching her husband absolutely self-destruct before the entire municipal court today. The brutal, absolutely flawless betrayal was utterly complete, permanently destroying any conceivable shred of lingering loyalty entirely forever today. Jonathan Pierce confidently stepped up directly to the heavy wooden podium, meticulously laying out an absolutely impenetrable, highly systematic legal defense. He smoothly submitted a massive, fully authenticated mountain of pristine medical records, officially documenting my perfect, undeniable psychological clarity and absolute cognitive competence. He effortlessly presented the flawless, impeccably organized corporate financial ledgers, categorically proving my masterful, entirely sound business management over the past 4 decades. The incredibly frail, confused old man narrative that Brandon had so maliciously fabricated was completely and violently shattered entirely before the very eyes of the silent court. Jonathan did not stop there. He aggressively introduced the incredibly damning high-definition security footage actively capturing Brandon's violent, unhinged home invasion the previous night. The massive digital screens positioned throughout the courtroom immediately displayed the absolutely undeniable crystal-clear video of Brandon viciously wielding the lethal tactical blade directly against my throat. The undeniable visual evidence of his unhinged, heavily violent extortion completely devastated any remaining incredibly thin illusion of a concerned, loving son merely seeking his father's personal protection. He effectively proved that the ruined Brandon was entirely motivated by absolute blinding, ruthless greed rather than any genuine familial care. Jonathan flawlessly dismantled every single pathetic lie Brandon had ever told, officially presenting the highly binding, fully signed legal confession explicitly outlining his massive elder abuse and extensive federal fraud. The entire municipal gallery watched in absolute, completely stunned silence as the brilliant defense attorney ruthlessly exposed the immense depth of Brandon's pure, unadulterated greed and incredible criminal depravity. The completely flawless, beautifully executed counterattack effortlessly obliterated the plaintiff's utterly fraudulent case, permanently shifting the absolute narrative from a pathetic civil dispute directly into the severe, incredibly unforgiving realm of massive federal criminal prosecution completely today. The presiding judge leaned far forward over the elevated wooden bench, delivering a shockingly scathing, incredibly furious judicial reprimand directly down onto Brandon's entirely shattered existence. He explicitly declared that he had never witnessed such a vile, repulsive, and highly malicious attempt to weaponize the municipal legal system against a perfectly healthy, generous, elderly father. He firmly and loudly dismissed the utterly fraudulent conservatorship petition with extreme, irreversible legal prejudice, permanently blocking Brandon from ever filing another frivolous claim. The angry judge did not hesitate to inflict maximum financial devastation upon the shackled plaintiff. He immediately and officially ordered Brandon to explicitly pay all of my expensive corporate legal fees without a single shred of delay. Brandon violently squeezed his wet eyes shut, physically reeling from the incredibly crushing weight of the absolute judicial annihilation. He was completely broke, facing millions of dollars in federal restitution and severely chained to the wooden floorboards. The judge glared completely through the pathetic, sobbing creature sitting perfectly broken before him and aggressively lifted his polished wooden gavel. He violently struck the heavy wooden-sounding block with a deafening, incredibly loud crash that echoed permanently throughout the silent, terrified courtroom. The incredibly sharp, brutal impact instantly terminated the pathetic civil proceedings, flawlessly transferring the absolute, entirely broken remnants of my son directly onto the severe, highly punitive federal criminal docket. Brandon was aggressively yanked upward by the heavily armed bailiffs and forcefully dragged completely away, heading directly toward his dark, incredibly lengthy, and highly deserved permanent federal prison sentence today, forever. The federal criminal trial officially commenced with the absolute terrifying efficiency of a perfectly oiled judicial machine. The lead district attorney confidently took the floor, standing incredibly tall before the silent, captivated jury box. He meticulously presented the state's entire case, immediately laying out an absolutely insurmountable mountain of pristine physical evidence. He systematically outlined the incredibly malicious, heavily premeditated corporate fraud, starting directly with the highly forged commercial mortgage documents. The prosecutor explicitly demonstrated how Brandon had actively manipulated the local banking registry, presenting the exact time-stamped electronic signatures used to illegally secure the massive underworld loan. He completely dismantled the pathetic facade of a wealthy dealership owner, aggressively projecting the desperate pawnshop receipts directly onto the massive courtroom displays. The jury clearly saw the exact, humiliating liquidation of Brandon's luxury watches and tailored suits, permanently destroying any lingering illusion of his financial stability. The prosecution did not pause to allow the defense any room to breathe. The attorney smoothly transitioned to the incredibly violent, deeply parasitic nature of the overall crime, explicitly playing the high-definition security recordings of the aggressive extortion attempts. He forcefully presented the final, totally devastating piece of undeniable physical evidence. He carefully held up the crisp, heavily binding legal confession obtained directly on my freezing, rain-soaked porch. He explicitly detailed how Brandon had willingly traded his entire legal freedom and signed away his absolute constitutional rights simply to escape a torrential downpour. The incredibly thorough, heavily documented timeline flawlessly illustrated a desperate, completely unhinged man who had violently attempted to utterly annihilate his own father purely for selfish, unadulterated corporate greed. The overwhelming weight of the flawless federal presentation hung heavily in the freezing courtroom air, leaving Brandon staring completely blankly at the polished mahogany table in absolute, entirely irreversible legal ruin entirely here today. The incredibly devastating climax of the federal prosecution arrived when the district attorney completely darkened the massive, perfectly silent courtroom. He aggressively activated the primary digital projector, loudly playing the original, entirely unedited video footage captured during my heavily fabricated retirement party. The massive, brilliant screens instantly illuminated the incredibly tense legal forum with the incredibly sharp, vibrant colors of the opulent country club ballroom. The entire federal court watched in absolute, completely dead silence as the incredibly toxic, highly abusive confrontation began to ruthlessly unfold. The incredibly clear, booming audio heavily echoed through the pristine courtroom speakers, explicitly capturing every single vile, deeply disrespectful insult Brandon had so arrogantly spat directly into my face. The captivated jury watched the incredibly pathetic, entirely unhinged son step aggressively forward on the massive digital screen. They simultaneously counted each incredibly violent, deeply demeaning physical motion as Brandon viciously jabbed his rigid index finger directly into my chest, exactly 9 consecutive times. He violently berated me, screaming that I was an entirely worthless, highly pathetic parasite who had completely squandered his valuable corporate inheritance. The incredibly sharp, perfectly synced audio instantly shifted, flawlessly broadcasting Megan's incredibly cruel, entirely unhinged laughter. Her deeply vicious, incredibly mocking cackle violently bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the federal courthouse, entirely exposing the pure, unadulterated malice, heavily fueling their massive, heavily coordinated domestic ambush. The 12 members of the seated jury sat completely paralyzed, their collective faces instantly hardening into pure, totally unforgiving, heavily concentrated contempt. They stared directly at the 2 incredibly pathetic villains sitting silently at the defense tables, physically repulsed by the undeniable, perfectly preserved digital reality of their incredible cruelty. Brandon physically sank entirely down into his wooden chair, violently attempting to completely hide his severely bruised, deeply flushed face from the burning, highly judgmental stares. The incredibly toxic, utterly parasitic nature of their incredibly fraudulent marriage was now permanently exposed, completely stripping away any incredibly tiny, totally remaining fractional shred of basic human compassion entirely forever today, inside this massive, perfectly silent federal courtroom, perfectly and absolutely. The heavily burdened jury required incredibly little time to fully digest the massive, totally impenetrable mountain of flawless physical evidence presented before them. They officially retired to the highly secure deliberation room, returning entirely completely to their assigned wooden seats within a single, incredibly brief, totally decisive hour. The strict, incredibly stoic foreperson confidently handed the sealed white envelope directly to the presiding federal judge. The incredibly quiet courtroom held its collective breath as the severe magistrate loudly read the final, entirely inescapable legal conclusions completely into the permanent official record. The jury had unanimously returned incredibly swift, completely undeniable guilty verdicts on absolutely every single massive federal count flawlessly presented here today. The stern judge aggressively turned his hardened, perfectly unforgiving gaze directly toward the completely defeated, severely trembling defendants. He heavily admonished their incredibly toxic, purely malicious greed, firmly stating that their incredibly vile actions completely demanded severe, highly punitive federal justice. He immediately and aggressively sentenced Brandon to exactly 8 lengthy, highly grueling years, completely inside a highly guarded, maximum security federal prison facility. The massive, incredibly rigid sentence was formally dictated for multiple major counts of severe aggravated fraud, highly calculated commercial forgery, and incredibly vicious, undeniable elder abuse. He then aggressively shifted his furious, highly critical attention directly to Megan. Despite her totally treacherous, heavily fabricated witness testimony previously offered against her own husband, she completely failed to entirely escape the severe federal wrath today. The totally disgusted judge officially sentenced her to exactly 5 harsh, incredibly long years behind thick steel bars for massive, undeniable identity theft and severely calculated, premeditated grand larceny. The massive, incredibly profound weight of their total absolute destruction finally crashed entirely down upon them permanently and completely tonight. The incredibly heavy, perfectly polished wooden gavel struck the massive sounding block with a deafening, incredibly final, totally irreversible crash. Armed federal bailiffs immediately stepped aggressively forward, brutally grabbing the highly toxic, completely convicted criminals by their severely bruised, heavily chained arms. They violently pulled Brandon and Megan entirely away from the polished wooden defense tables, forcefully steering them directly toward the dark, incredibly cold holding cells awaiting them perfectly behind the thick courtroom walls. The absolute, completely terrifying reality of his massive, highly secure concrete cage entirely shattered Brandon's severely fractured, completely exhausted mind. He instantly broke down, completely violently fighting against the incredibly strong, totally unyielding iron grip of the massive federal officers. He wildly thrashed his completely sweating, deeply flushed head entirely backward, hysterically screaming directly across the crowded, highly silent room for his father to completely save him just one incredibly pathetic, totally desperate final time. His incredibly loud, wildly unhinged, heavily weeping pleas completely echoed throughout the massive judicial space, desperately begging for pure, entirely unearned paternal mercy. I remained perfectly silent, unaffected by his incredibly frantic, completely manic, totally pathetic screaming today. I slowly stood perfectly upright from the hard wooden bench, deliberately taking my absolute time. I calmly reached down and meticulously buttoned my comfortable, incredibly familiar, heavily worn jacket, securely fastening the simple garment entirely against the freezing draft. I smoothly turned my broad back perfectly toward the totally defeated creature weeping violently inside the heavy chains. I calmly walked out of the massive federal courtroom without ever offering a backward glance tonight. Melvin stepped through the heavy oak front door and engaged the secure deadbolt. The immediate absolute silence of the sprawling estate pressed heavily against his broad shoulders. He slowly unbuttoned his tailored wool coat and hung it perfectly on the brass rack. He walked deliberately through the dimly lit hallway, his polished leather shoes striking the hardwood floor with a steady rhythmic echo. He passed the grand formal dining room where his family once gathered to celebrate fabricated milestones. He stood in the arched doorway of the immaculate living room, staring at the exact spot where Brandon had aggressively brandished a tactical blade against his throat. The violent memory did not provoke a single flinch or lingering tremor of fear. Melvin simply acknowledged the profound, undeniably permanent absence of his only son. He ascended the sweeping staircase and paused outside the closed door of Brandon's childhood bedroom. He firmly gripped the brass handle but refused to turn it. There was absolutely nothing left inside that room but hollow ghosts and toxic illusions. Melvin continued down the quiet corridor toward his master suite. He felt a sharp, entirely natural pang of paternal grief wash over his chest, heavily mourning the innocent child who had died decades before the greedy, unhinged monster completely took his place. He deeply inhaled the crisp, cool air circulating through the pristine house. He consciously and completely accepted the immense pain of his absolute solitude today. He fully recognized that clinging desperately to a fundamentally poisoned relationship was infinitely worse than peacefully living with an entirely empty cup. He walked directly to his large bay window and stared out at the sprawling, perfectly manicured front lawn. He was finally entirely alone, but he was undeniably completely free tonight, without a single heavy regret. The next morning, Melvin arrived early at his executive corner office, aggressively initiating the absolute total liquidation of every single commercial asset previously tied to Brandon's former fraudulent life. He sat rigidly behind his massive mahogany desk and swiftly executed incredibly decisive, highly punitive corporate maneuvers. He explicitly directed his primary financial managers to systematically dismantle the entire fake luxury empire Brandon had so arrogantly constructed upon his stolen wealth. He decisively sold the massive, entirely abandoned commercial dealership lot directly to a highly lucrative, massive regional hospital expansion project. The heavy, unyielding demolition crews arrived exactly 2 short days later, brutally tearing down the gleaming glass showroom windows and violently ripping up the perfectly paved asphalt. The incredibly destructive excavators completely leveled the heavily branded structures, effortlessly turning Brandon's incredibly precious professional headquarters into a massive, dusty pile of crushed concrete and twisted steel rebar. Melvin then aggressively authorized his lead corporate banking representatives to publicly and immediately auction off the entire repossessed fleet of high-end imported luxury vehicles. The incredibly expensive sports cars and sleek designer sedans were viciously sold to the absolute highest municipal bidders for pure, unadulterated cash. The significant financial proceeds completely bypassed Brandon's frozen accounts and were instantly absorbed directly back into Melvin's massive, highly secure holding company. He directed his elite accountants to formally hunt down and forcefully acquire every microscopic outstanding debt Brandon still secretly owed to highly aggressive municipal creditors. He explicitly officially bought the massive personal loans and immediately called them due, locking the iron bars tightly around his shattered financial cage tonight. Melvin did not pause to allow a single fraction of his son's deeply parasitic legacy to peacefully survive the devastating financial purge. He ruthlessly terminated every single lingering vendor contract, officially canceled all underlying municipal lease agreements, and violently severed the remaining toxic corporate ties entirely. Every single undeniable trace of his incredibly arrogant son's completely fabricated business empire was perfectly and absolutely wiped directly from the physical earth. The massive financial extraction was executed with breathtaking, incredibly terrifying precision, permanently erasing Brandon's fake identity completely and entirely forever today. Melvin sat quietly inside the secure, perfectly soundproofed conference room alongside his fiercely loyal attorney, Jonathan Pierce. The heavy oak table was completely covered with pristine, beautifully drafted legal documents explicitly outlining Melvin's massive, undeniably permanent corporate legacy. He firmly grabbed a polished gold pen and decisively signed his absolute legal name across the crisp white pages. He officially funneled the incredibly massive, completely liquidated millions directly into the formal creation of the highly prestigious Diane Wright Foundation. Melvin intentionally named the incredibly powerful charitable organization directly after his beloved late wife, permanently honoring her incredibly kind, deeply generous spirit forever today. The massive, fully endowed corporate entity was explicitly engineered to aggressively provide absolutely free, high-caliber legal representation and comprehensive financial protection directly for completely vulnerable elderly victims currently facing severe family exploitation. Melvin explicitly designed the massive corporate charter to brutally hunt down greedy, unhinged relatives, maliciously attempting to legally steal generational wealth through incredibly fraudulent medical conservatorships and severe emotional extortion. He strictly authorized Jonathan to officially hire the absolute sharpest, incredibly ruthless civil attorneys available within the municipal jurisdiction to systematically crush parasitic abusers without any remaining mercy. Melvin heavily invested his entire remaining fortune to permanently ensure that absolutely no innocent, deeply trusting parent would ever helplessly face the incredibly dark, deeply terrifying reality he had so recently conquered. He peacefully smiled as the wet black ink finally dried on the incredibly powerful corporate charter today. He had completely transformed the incredibly toxic, highly destructive greed of his only son directly into a massive, heavily fortified shield perfectly designed to protect the innocent permanently. His absolute, undeniably incredible life's work was finally entirely complete, flawlessly securing his true, perfect, highly protected corporate legacy forever and ever tonight without any lingering doubts whatsoever. Melvin sat quietly at his massive oak desk, meticulously signing the absolute final endowment checks required to formally launch his newly minted corporate charity. The warm, late afternoon sunlight gently illuminated the pristine, highly organized executive office, casting long, peaceful shadows directly across the polished hardwood floor. Jonathan Pierce slowly entered the silent room, his professional demeanor notably subdued as he approached the heavy wooden desk. He carefully held a single, incredibly cheap, heavily wrinkled white envelope firmly in his right hand, He silently placed the physical correspondence directly onto the immaculate glass surface, deliberately positioning it perfectly within Melvin's direct line of sight. The incredibly coarse, highly abrasive paper prominently featured a bright red, officially stamped seal, explicitly processed directly through the massive, heavily fortified state penitentiary mail system. Melvin slowly lowered his expensive gold pen, completely halting his vital corporate work. He stared incredibly blankly at the dark, perfectly legible handwriting meticulously scrawled across the absolute top left corner of the cheap envelope. The highly recognizable, incredibly desperate return address explicitly belonged to his fully incarcerated, entirely ruined son, Brandon. The incredibly stark, highly pathetic reality of his son's severe federal imprisonment rested completely silently upon the pristine desktop today. Melvin did not violently tear the sealed paper open, nor did he frantically reach for a sharp silver letter opener. He simply sat perfectly still in his high leather chair, calmly staring completely downward at the incredibly sad, utterly pathetic physical manifestation of incredibly deep, entirely permanent familial destruction tonight. Melvin held the incredibly coarse, heavily wrinkled envelope firmly between his aged hands. The cheap abrasive paper felt distinctly foreign against his skin, a stark physical contrast to the polished mahogany desk currently supporting his forearms. A remarkably brief, deeply irrational flicker of pure paternal hope briefly illuminated the darkest corners of his entirely exhausted mind. He sat in the profound silence of his secure study, actively wondering if the harsh, unyielding reality of a maximum security federal penitentiary might have finally forced a genuine psychological breakthrough. He genuinely considered the fleeting possibility that the brutal isolation of a cold concrete cell had successfully stripped away the blinding layers of his son's corporate arrogance, leaving behind a profound, entirely authentic sense of ultimate moral remorse. Melvin heavily inhaled the quiet, conditioned air circulating through his immaculate office, vividly remembering the bright, highly ambitious little boy he had raised entirely alone following Diane's tragic passing. He desperately wanted to believe that the severe structural collapse of Brandon's deeply fraudulent empire had somehow miraculously triggered a fundamental personal resurrection. He slowly rubbed his thumb directly across the vivid red institutional stamp marking the top corner, actively confronting the immense heavy gravity of the permanent familial divide spanning completely between them today. He perfectly understood that reading the enclosed words would permanently cement the final chapter of their incredibly painful shared history. With a deep, remarkably steady breath, Melvin meticulously slid his index finger perfectly under the cheap adhesive flap. He carefully tore the fragile paper seal completely open, producing a sharp, incredibly distinct ripping sound that echoed loudly throughout the perfectly silent room. He slowly reached his right hand deep inside the torn casing and gently pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of cheap yellowed lined prison paper to read today. His heart remained absolutely steady as he began reading. The hastily scribbled letter contained absolutely zero personal accountability. The jagged, incredibly aggressive blue ink violently slashed across the thin-lined paper, perfectly reflecting the absolute psychological chaos actively raging inside Brandon's heavily shattered, permanently locked federal prison cell. He completely bypassed any standard greeting, instantly launching directly into a massive, incredibly unhinged tirade, heavily fueled by pure, entirely unadulterated hatred. He viciously cursed Melvin with incredibly vile, deeply repugnant language, aggressively accusing his own father of deliberately engineering a massive, entirely demonic trap, flawlessly designed to totally annihilate his undeniably perfect corporate life. Brandon vehemently refused to acknowledge his massive commercial forgery, entirely ignoring his highly destructive, deeply parasitic elder abuse completely. Instead, he explicitly painted himself as the ultimate innocent victim of a highly sophisticated, completely ruthless maternal foundation plot maliciously executed without a single warning. He aggressively claimed that Melvin had absolutely never possessed a single ounce of genuine paternal love for him, wildly asserting that Diane would have been entirely disgusted by her husband's incredibly cold, highly calculated, incredibly brutal retaliation. The totally unhinged convict meticulously poured his absolute venom directly onto the cheap paper, furiously promising that the immense spiritual weight of his absolute financial ruin would ultimately crush Melvin's fragile remaining conscience entirely. He explicitly and violently wrote that he genuinely hoped Melvin would completely, physically wither away, and ultimately die entirely alone inside his massive, entirely empty, incredibly quiet luxury mansion, without a single solitary friend remaining to offer basic comfort today. The incredibly toxic, utterly malicious nature of the written correspondence remained absolutely absolute and entirely incurable forever. He completely demonstrated that he was fundamentally incapable of basic moral reflection, permanently cementing his incredibly vile status as a totally irredeemable, highly predatory monster, completely consumed by his incredibly dark, totally unforgiving greed entirely forever tonight. He clearly chose to fully embrace his incredibly dark delusions perfectly, showcasing his absolute failure to ever accept the devastating consequences of his incredibly vicious, undeniable federal crimes today entirely. His absolute refusal to accept reality remained completely intact. Melvin stood perfectly still inside his immaculate study, quietly reading the incredibly harsh, entirely unforgiving words, a meticulous second time to ensure absolute comprehension. The heavy, incredibly vicious insults flawlessly detailed across the cheap prison stationery did not trigger a single solitary ounce of lingering paternal anger or deep, devastating sorrow within his fully hardened chest. Instead, a truly profound, incredibly sweeping sense of ultimate spiritual absolution completely washed over his deeply exhausted, remarkably calm mind. The incredibly vile, undeniably toxic letter definitively proved beyond any lingering shadow of a reasonable doubt that his incredibly severe, highly punitive retaliatory actions were entirely justified. The incredibly precise, totally calculated destruction of Brandon's fraudulent corporate empire was absolutely necessary to permanently neutralize a completely irredeemable, highly predatory threat. The incredibly desperate, highly manipulative creature sitting inside that dark federal cell was utterly incapable of genuine redemption, completely validating Melvin's incredibly difficult, highly painful decision to permanently sever all remaining familial ties today. He slowly placed the remarkably abrasive, heavily wrinkled paper directly onto the pristine glass surface of his large mahogany desk. He smoothly reached inside his tailored pocket and deliberately retrieved a highly polished silver matchbook. He calmly opened the pristine metallic casing and firmly pulled a single wooden match directly from the perfectly arranged row. He decisively struck the vibrant red tip against the rough friction strip, instantly igniting a small, bright orange flame that brilliantly illuminated the deeply shadowed room. He held the burning, incredibly hot wooden stick directly against the jagged bottom corner of the incredibly toxic, highly insulting prison correspondence, watching closely as the fragile, heavily lined paper immediately began to severely blacken and entirely blister tonight without any remaining hesitation. Melvin stood perfectly still, silently watching the incredibly hateful, entirely venomous written words rapidly curl and violently dissolve into thick black ash. The intensely bright orange flame aggressively consumed the cheap-lined paper, permanently erasing Brandon's incredibly toxic, utterly pathetic final existence completely from the physical earth. He firmly pinched the incredibly hot, severely blackened remaining corner, waiting patiently until the absolute very last possible second before smoothly dropping the burning remnants directly into his massive stone fireplace. The incredibly fragile, severely charred debris fluttered gently downward, landing silently amongst the heavy, cold iron grates to permanently rot. The dark, incredibly malevolent ghost of his incredibly greedy, entirely unhinged son was finally and officially laid perfectly to rest forever today. Melvin smoothly turned his broad back away from the dying embers, completely abandoning the incredibly painful, heavily toxic past without a single lingering regret. He calmly walked directly into his pristine marble bathroom and meticulously washed his aged hands with warm water and thick lavender soap, systematically scrubbing away the absolute last remaining traces of the incredibly abrasive, heavily corrupted prison correspondence. He smoothly dried his clean hands on a pristine white towel and walked directly into the immaculate gourmet kitchen. He calmly boiled fresh, clean water and quietly prepared a single incredibly soothing cup of hot chamomile tea. He gently grasped the warm porcelain mug, deeply inhaling the incredibly fragrant, highly comforting steam. Melvin slowly turned and walked deliberately toward the heavy oak front door, totally prepared to confidently step completely outside and fully embrace his bright, secure new corporate legacy forever tonight without hesitation. Melvin pushed open the heavy oak front door and stepped deliberately onto his spacious porch, just as the crisp autumn sun began its vibrant descent. The biting evening chill felt incredibly refreshing against his aged skin. He took a long, steady breath, deeply savoring the profound tranquility currently settling over the sprawling residential street. The neighborhood was perfectly quiet, entirely devoid of the toxic chaos that had completely consumed his former life. The rustling amber leaves provided a soothing rhythm to the majestic twilight. A familiar figure slowly approached along the pristine concrete sidewalk. It was the notoriously vocal neighbor who had eagerly circulated the completely fabricated rumors regarding the supposed mental decline months prior. The older man physically paused at the absolute edge of the manicured lawn, his posture noticeably rigid with undeniable hesitation. He did not quickly look away or attempt to aggressively avoid eye contact as he had routinely done during the heavily publicized trial. Instead, he turned directly toward the wooden porch and offered a profoundly deep, incredibly respectful nod of absolute acknowledgement. The silent gesture spoke immense volumes, entirely serving as an unspoken apology and a total surrender to the undeniable truth. Melvin maintained his perfectly steady gaze and calmly returned the subtle nod with effortless grace. He did not harbor any lingering resentment toward the easily manipulated townspeople. His absolute dignity was completely and flawlessly restored within the broader municipal community. The incredibly fragile, pathetic illusions carefully spun by his deeply greedy son were permanently shattered. Melvin watched the neighbors silently continue down the darkening street, feeling an absolute, entirely unshakable sense of profound personal vindication. He wrapped his warm hands comfortably around his ceramic mug, fully embracing the majestic golden hour, completely free from any remaining shadow of toxic doubt, entirely today, permanently forever now. The soothing residential silence was suddenly broken when his mobile phone began ringing directly inside his tailored jacket pocket. Melvin smoothly placed his warm ceramic mug onto the small wooden table completely adjacent to his rocking chair. He calmly retrieved the vibrating device and explicitly answered the incoming transmission without a single moment of unnecessary delay. The highly energetic, incredibly passionate voice belonging to a newly hired lead attorney for the Diane Wright Foundation excitedly flooded the miniature speaker. She breathlessly reported an absolutely monumental, incredibly swift legal victory formally achieved within the municipal family court mere moments prior. She explicitly detailed how their heavily funded corporate legal team had successfully secured a massive, entirely ironclad judicial injunction. The incredibly powerful legal maneuver officially and permanently protected an incredibly vulnerable, completely terrified 80-year-old widow from the vicious grasp of a highly predatory, incredibly abusive son-in-law. The exceptionally ruthless, deeply parasitic abuser had maliciously attempted to forcefully seize her entire generational estate using heavily fabricated medical documents and severe emotional extortion. The brilliant attorney proudly announced that the vile predator was now completely stripped of all legal authority and absolutely facing severe federal prosecution entirely thanks to the immense corporate resources Melvin had personally provided. Melvin listened to the incredibly joyful, entirely triumphant voice, completely illuminating the evening air. A profoundly deep, entirely unshakable sense of absolute spiritual fulfillment instantly, completely washed directly over his remarkably calm mind. The massive, beautifully structured corporate system he had deliberately built completely from the deeply painful, heavily toxic ashes of his personal tragedy was officially working completely flawlessly today. He politely congratulated the incredibly fierce, highly dedicated legal advocate and smoothly terminated the highly satisfying phone call. He leaned entirely backward against his comfortable wooden seat, incredibly satisfied, perfectly content, fully relaxed forever, immensely proud, undeniably at eternal peace, watching completely silently the deeply gorgeous, vibrant sky darken flawlessly overhead. Right now, exactly today, profoundly tonight, completely forever, without a single trace of lingering sorrow remaining inside his fully cleansed, deeply protected, completely peaceful, incredibly quiet human heart. Melvin sat heavily backward into the gentle rhythmic motion of his favorite wooden rocking chair. He slowly raised his right hand and remarkably gently pressed his aged fingertips directly against his solid chest. He vividly, completely, silently remembered the exact, undeniably brutal sensation of those incredibly forceful, highly disrespectful, physical jabs aggressively delivered by his entirely unhinged son during the heavily fabricated anniversary party. Those 9 distinct, incredibly violent strikes had officially and permanently ignited the absolutely brutal, entirely irreversible defensive war that flawlessly culminated in Brandon's total, completely devastating incarceration. He stared perfectly calmly outward across the incredibly quiet, thoroughly manicured lawn, gently sloping away from his secure porch. A profoundly striking, undeniably absolute realization instantly crystallized directly inside his entirely peaceful, fully unburdened soul tonight. He explicitly recognized that he had absolutely never actively destroyed his immediate family through any malicious aggression or completely selfish corporate greed. He had simply deliberately stopped standing firmly between the incredibly toxic parasites and the absolutely crushing, totally inevitable legal consequences of their own monstrous, purely sociopathic avarice. The incredibly arrogant, completely vile predators had fully orchestrated their own total, undeniable demise by foolishly choosing to violently attack the exact protective fortress that had quietly shielded their deeply parasitic existence for multiple decades. Melvin completely removed the vital, entirely unappreciated structural support beam, willingly allowing the deeply corrupted, fundamentally rotting familial ceiling to simply crash violently downward upon their utterly clueless, heavily entitled heads. The immense, incredibly heavy emotional burden of entirely misplaced paternal guilt was absolutely permanently lifted from his broad shoulders completely forever tonight. He incredibly deeply exhaled, completely banishing the incredibly dark, intensely toxic historical memory entirely away from his beautifully peaceful, perfectly tranquil, incredibly vibrant future directly right, exactly precisely now, completely forever today. The stunning, majestic autumn sunset slowly painted the vast evening sky in incredibly vibrant, deeply saturated shades of brilliant gold and rich royal purple. Melvin smoothly lifted the warm ceramic mug directly toward his aged lips and took a slow, highly satisfying sip of the deeply soothing chamomile tea. He deeply inhaled the incredibly crisp, remarkably fresh autumn air filling the perfectly silent residential property. He felt the pure, undeniable, completely exhilarating sensation of absolute total personal freedom deeply washing entirely over his deeply protected, fully resurrected spirit. The incredibly hard, utterly ruthless lessons flawlessly executed throughout the massive, completely devastating corporate war had thoroughly established a profoundly striking, undeniably absolute universal truth permanently tonight. You must absolutely never intentionally underestimate the profound, incredibly calculated, highly observant silence of a deeply devoted, perfectly patient father under any conceivable circumstances forever. The precise, incredibly exact, definitive moment he formally and finally completely stops, desperately trying to patiently raise his toxic, utterly irredeemable child, is the exact, beautifully precise moment he permanently and successfully becomes the absolute, completely undisputed, entirely untouchable master of the incredibly deadly, highly sophisticated corporate game today. Melvin peacefully lowered his warm mug directly onto the wooden porch railing and simply smiled completely silently into the magnificent, deeply beautiful approaching night. He was finally perfectly, entirely safe from the crushing weight of utterly unearned paternal guilt, happily ready to fully embrace his absolutely pristine, completely unburdened legacy with profound, purely unbroken joy, right here, entirely forever, starting exactly right now, today, unconditionally. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives of justice and redemption and share your thoughts in the comments below.